In Coldwater Penitentiary, a black inmate was about to face the full weight of a white prison guard's grudge. What started as another routine cell inspection spiraled when Officer Ray Grayson, the prison's enforcer of silent oppression, decided today was the day Malik Carter would finally break. Malik Carter wasn't your typical inmate trying to keep his head down and ride out his sentence. For 12 years, he had endured the psychological warfare of wrongful incarceration, known for his razor-sharp legal mind and a reputation as Coldwater's jailhouse lawyer. When Grayson planted contraband in Malik's cell and used it as justification to have him beaten and thrown into solitary, he had no idea he was messing with a man who had spent years studying the system, biding his time, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Malik didn't fight back with fists. He fought with patience, strategy, and the power of a system that Grayson himself had built on lies. What began as a white guard's abuse of power would become a reckoning that would shake the very foundation of Coldwater Penitentiary. The warden, the guards, and every inmate on Cell Block D would never forget the day Ray Grayson's reign ended. Not with the force he had always relied on, but with the weight of his own corruption crashing down on him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning siren at Coldwater Penitentiary didn't so much wake the inmates as it confirmed what their bodies already knew. Another day of surviving had begun. In Cell Block D, Malik Carter's eyes were open before the first harsh note. 12 years inside had trained his body to anticipate the daily rhythm of confinement. Malik sat up on his thin mattress, feet finding the cold concrete floor. His movements were deliberate, practiced, the careful choreography of a man who'd learned that attention meant danger. At 42, his body bore the history of his incarceration in a constellation of scars, each one a chapter he'd rather forget. From 3 cells down, he heard Big Dre's characteristic morning cough, a sign that the leader of Coldwater's dominant black gang was awake and assessing the day. The relationship between the two men was complex, respect without friendship, alliance without trust. Big Dre had offered Malik protection more than once. Malik had declined each time. Protection came with obligations he couldn't afford. On your feet, ladies. The voice belonged to Officer Ray Grayson, and it carried the casual cruelty that had made him feared throughout Coldwater. Cell inspection. Anyone still in bed gets a personal wake-up call. The threat wasn't empty. Malik had witnessed Grayson's wake-up calls, swift, brutal beatings justified as necessary force against non-compliant inmates. The administration never questioned these incidents. The other guards never reported them. Malik stood at attention beside his bunk as footsteps approached. Through the bars, he could see Grayson moving deliberately down the row, flanked by Officer Bill Rawlings, a man whose moral compass had rusted away years ago. Well, if it isn't our jailhouse lawyer. Grayson stopped at Malik's cell, lips curling into what passed for a smile. He was a large man, over 6 feet tall with shoulders broadened by years of weightlifting, his Coldwater uniform always perfectly pressed. The polished appearance was part of his psychological game. Control through contrast. Still working on that appeal, Carter? How many is that now? 4 denied? Malik kept his expression neutral. Just following the process, Officer Grayson. The process? Grayson chuckled, unlocking the cell door. You people always think you can beat the system. Never occurs to you that maybe the system worked exactly as it should. The slur was implied rather than stated. Grayson was too smart for overt racism when other officers were present. But Malik had heard the unfiltered version during countless private conversations over the years. Grayson stepped into the cell, his bulk filling the small space. Rawlings remained outside, his disinterested gaze fixed somewhere beyond the cell block. Cell search, Grayson announced, though no one had asked. He began methodically dismantling Malik's carefully ordered possessions, legal papers, books, letters from his sister. Each item was examined and discarded on the floor with deliberate disregard. Malik stood immobile, eyes fixed on the wall opposite. Reaction was what Grayson wanted. reaction was what Grayson would use. "What's this?" Grayson held up a worn notebook, flipping through pages of Malik's small, precise handwriting. "Your memoir? Innocence Behind Bars, that your working title?" "Case notes, sir." Malik's voice remained level. "For my appeal." "Appeal denied. 4 times. Grayson tossed the notebook onto the growing pile on the floor. "You know what they say about doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results?" Rawlings chuckled from the doorway. "That's the definition of insanity, Carter." "Or persistence," Malik replied. Something dangerous flickered across Grayson's face. "You calling me insane, Carter?" "No, sir." Malik kept his gaze steady. "Just persistent." The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken history. Then Grayson smiled, a gesture that never reached his eyes. "Persistent. I like that." He moved closer, dropping his voice. "I've been here 15 years, you've been here 12. I'll still be here when they carry you out in a box, Carter. That's persistence." Before Malik could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Officer Grayson? Everything okay in there?" Standing at the cell block entrance was a young man in a pristine uniform that still held department store creases. Jake Landry, 24 years old and exactly 4 hours into his first shift as a Coldwater correctional officer, shifted, uncomfortably under Grayson's sudden scrutiny. "Landry, right?" Grayson stepped out of the cell, mood shifting. "Training day. Who assigned you to D block?" "Captain Morris, sir. Said to shadow you and Officer Rawlings." Grayson exchanged a look with Rawlings. Morris has a sense of humor. "Well, come on then. You're just in time for a lesson in contraband detection." As they moved to the next cell, Malik knelt to gather his scattered possessions. Through the bars, he watched the interaction between the veteran guards and the rookie. Landry's posture was stiff, his expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. A man trying to project authority he hadn't yet earned. An hour later, the inmates of Cell Block D filed into the cafeteria for breakfast. Malik moved through the line, accepted his tray of pale eggs and rubbery toast, and took his usual seat at the corner table, back to the wall, eyes on the room. The habit had kept him alive for 12 years. Across the cafeteria, a cluster of white inmates with crude tattoos watched him with undisguised hostility. The Iron Brotherhood, Coldwater's white supremacist gang, had been gunning for Malik ever since he'd testified in a prison assault case 3 years earlier. The victim had been a young black inmate, the perpetrators, Brotherhood members. Malik's testimony had extended their sentences by 5 years each. Only Grayson's peculiar protection had kept them at bay, not out of concern for Malik, but because Grayson preferred to handle Malik's punishment personally. The Brotherhood was a blunt instrument. Grayson saw himself as a surgeon. "They watching you again?" Big Dre slid his tray onto the table opposite Malik. At 53, with 20 years of a life sentence behind him, Andre Big Dre Washington had the physical presence of a linebacker gone slightly to seed and the calculated gaze of a chess master. Nothing happened in Coldwater without his knowledge. "They're always watching," Malik replied, not looking up from his tray. "Different today." Dre's voice dropped. "Word is Grayson gave them the green light." Malik's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "Why now?" "New warden's making him nervous. Martinez is a reformer, talks about accountability, oversight. Bad news for a man like Grayson." Malik absorbed this information, mind already calculating implications. Ellen Martinez, the first female warden in Coldwater's 70-year history, had arrived 3 days ago amid rumors of a comprehensive review of institutional practices. Most inmates were skeptical. Promises of reform came and went like seasons. "So I'm what? A message to the new administration?" Malik asked. Dre shrugged massive shoulders. "You're convenient, educated, outspoken, keep filing those appeals. Perfect example for Grayson to show what happens when inmates get too comfortable." Malik scanned the room again. The Brotherhood members had spread out, moving to different tables. The pattern was familiar. Strategic positioning before an attack. "When?" Malik asked. Yard time, after lunch. Dre scooped a forkful of eggs. I could put some people around you. Malik shook his head. I handle my own problems. Your funeral? Dre chewed thoughtfully. Actually, it might literally be your funeral. I'm touched by your concern. Not concern, investment. Dre leaned forward. You've got something most of these fools don't, a brain that works. Might need that brain soon with changes coming. Before Malik could respond, the cafeteria doors swung open. Warden Ellen Martinez entered, flanked by 2 senior officers. Conversation ceased as inmates and guards alike turned to observe this rare appearance. Martinez was not what most had expected. Instead of the stereotypical prison administrator, middle-aged, overweight, perpetually harried, she was a trim woman in her early 40s with the composed demeanor of someone accustomed to being underestimated. Her dark hair was pulled back, in a severe bun, and she wore a charcoal pantsuit rather than a uniform, a subtle but deliberate distinction between herself and the staff. Good morning, she addressed the silent cafeteria. For those I haven't met, I'm Warden Martinez. I'll be making my way through all areas of Coldwater over the next week. My door is open to concerns from both staff and inmates. I believe in transparency and accountability. Malik watched Grayson's reaction from across the room. The senior guard's expression remained neutral, but his body had tensed, hands clasped, too tightly behind his back. Additionally, Martinez continued, I've initiated a review of all parole applications denied in the past 5 years, as well as appeals with potential merit. This institution has had a notably low rate of parole approvals, and I intend to understand why. A current of murmurs rippled through the inmates. Malik felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a flutter of genuine hope quickly suppressed. Hope was dangerous currency in places like Coldwater. That's all for now. Carry on. Martinez nodded to the room and departed, leaving a wake of speculation behind her. Review of appeals, Dre said thoughtfully. That's you, jailhouse lawyer. That's me, Malik agreed, eyes still on Grayson, who was now conferring urgently with Rawlings by the door. And that, Dre nodded toward the guards, is why you've got a target on your back today. Grayson can't touch the warden, but he can touch you. The yard at Coldwater was a bleak rectangle of cracked concrete surrounded by 30-foot walls topped with razor wire. Inmates called it the pan, because on summer days like this one, it heated like cast iron under the Alabama sun. Malik stepped out into the glare, automatically scanning for threats. The Brotherhood members had positioned themselves near the weight pile, a concrete slab supporting rusted iron bars bent into crude barbells. Their leader, a heavily tattooed lifer named Krebs, made a show of watching Malik's entrance. At the guard station overlooking the yard, Grayson stood with Rawlings and the rookie Landry. Malik noted how Grayson positioned himself. Casual posture, mirrored sunglasses reflecting the yard, one hand resting near but not on his baton, the stance of a man anticipating action. For 40 minutes, Malik maintained his routine, walking the perimeter, stopping for brief conversations with neutral inmates, keeping mobile. The expected attack didn't come, and he began to wonder if Dre's information had been wrong. Then, as he passed near the basketball court, a fight erupted between 2 black inmates from rival neighborhood sets. Guards rushed to respond, Grayson deliberately moving in the opposite direction. In the momentary chaos, Krebs and 3 Brotherhood members closed in on Malik from behind. The first blow, a weight plate swung in a sock, caught him across the shoulders, driving him to his knees. The second missed his head by inches as he rolled sideways. Malik fought back with the precision of a man who'd survived worse, landing a strike to Krebs' throat that bought him seconds of space. But they had numbers and weapons. A makeshift blade sliced across his ribs. A boot connected with his kidney. Malik tucked into himself, protecting vital areas as the assault continued. Through gaps in the circling attackers, he saw Grayson watching, impassively from 20 yards away, making no move to intervene. What Grayson didn't see was Jake Landry, frozen in horror at the guard station, reaching for his radio before Rawlings clamped a restraining hand on his arm. Protocol says we wait for backup when multiple inmates are involved, Rawlings said, voice low. Officer safety first. But they're killing him, Landry protested. They're teaching him, Rawlings corrected. There's a difference. You'll learn. The beating lasted 90 seconds, an eternity to Malik before other guards responded. By then, Krebs and his associates had melted back into the general population, and Malik lay bloodied on the concrete, consciousness flickering at the edges. As he was lifted onto a stretcher, his gaze locked with Grayson's. The guard removed, his sunglasses revealing eyes cold with satisfaction and mouthed 2 words, "Stay down." Malik's split lips curved into the ghost of a smile in response, a gesture that visibly unsettled Grayson. Because despite the pain radiating through his body, despite the blood and bruises, Malik recognized something that his tormentor didn't yet grasp. The rules were changing at Coldwater. For 12 years, Ray Grayson had written those rules in pain and fear, but Warden Martinez represented something new, a variable in a previously immutable equation. And variables created opportunities. In the prison infirmary, as a disinterested doctor stitched the gash along his ribs, Malik began calculating his next move. The attack had been meant to cow him, to ensure his silence when Martinez's review began. Instead, it had confirmed what he most needed to know. Ray Grayson was afraid. Fear made men careless. Carelessness created openings. And Malik Carter, wrongfully convicted, repeatedly denied justice but never broken, had become an expert at exploiting openings. He would need to be patient. He would need to be precise. But for the first time in over a decade, the balance of power at Coldwater Penitentiary had shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't much, barely a hairline crack in Grayson's fortress of control, but for a man who had survived on microscopic victories, it was enough to build upon. As the doctor finished the last stitch, Malik closed his eyes, mind already assembling, the first pieces of a plan 12 years in the making. Grayson had told him to stay down, but Malik had never been good at following orders, especially from men who deserved to be behind bars more than he did. The fluorescent lights of the infirmary buzzed overhead as Malik traced the fresh line of stitches along his ribs. 7 new scars to add to his collection, Grayson's latest signature on his body. The doctor had discharged him after the bare minimum of care, eager to avoid questions about how such injuries could occur under watchful supervision. 3 days had passed since the yard attack. 3 days of careful recovery, of mapping out possibilities. 3 days of listening to the shifting currents of Coldwater through the whispered intelligence network that flowed between cells. Heard, "You're getting out today." The voice belonged to Miguel Suarez, an elderly trustee who cleaned the infirmary. He wiped down the adjacent bed, eyes never meeting Malik's. "Word is Martinez herself asked about your condition." Malik absorbed this information silently. Warden Martinez asking questions was exactly the kind of detail Grayson would find threatening, which meant Grayson would be watching, waiting for Malik's return to general population. "Thanks, Miguel." Malik swung his legs over the edge of the bed, testing his body's response. Pain flared, but not debilitating. He'd function. He'd have to. "One more thing," Miguel murmured, still cleaning. "New guard's been asking about you, the young one, Landry." That was unexpected. "What's he asking?" "If you really did the crime they put you in for. If Grayson had it out for you special." Miguel shrugged. Curious kid. Dangerous questions. Before Malik could probe further, the infirmary door swung open. Officer Rawlings entered, his expression set in its habitual boredom. "On your feet, Carter. You're cleared for return to population." As Malik followed Rawlings through Coldwater's labyrinthine corridors, he cataloged the subtle changes 3 days had wrought. New memos on bulletin boards, policy updates with Martinez's signature. Guards clustered in quiet conversation, breaking apart when inmates passed. The atmosphere held the electric tension of a system under pressure. "Your appeal file's been flagged," Rawlings said suddenly, not turning around. "Warden's review team pulled it yesterday." Malik kept his face neutral despite the surge of hope. That right? Don't get excited. Grayson's handling the preliminary review of all D-block cases personally. Rawlings glanced back, a malicious smile playing at his lips. Professional thoroughness, he calls it. The message was clear. Any path to justice would still run through Ray Grayson. Malik had expected nothing less. At the entrance to Cell Block D, they encountered Warden Martinez conducting an inspection with Captain Morris. Martinez spotted them and altered her course, approaching with the direct efficiency that was becoming her trademark. Mr. Carter. She addressed Malik, not Rawlings, a subtle but significant breach of Coldwater protocol. I'm reviewing the incident report from your altercation in the yard. Officer Grayson noted you were engaged in suspicious activity prior to the assault. Malik met her gaze steadily. I was walking, Warden. That's suspicious at Coldwater, if you're me. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, crossed Martinez's face. I see. And did you identify your attackers to the responding officers? No, ma'am. May I ask why not? Rawlings shifted uncomfortably beside him. Malik measured his response carefully. This wasn't just conversation, it was reconnaissance. Prison has its own justice system, Warden. I'm serving my time according to its rules. Its rules or Officer Grayson's? Martinez asked pointedly. The directness of the question startled him. Before he could formulate a safe response, Officer Jake Landry appeared at the end of the corridor, visibly tensing when he saw the gathering. Officer Landry, Martinez called him over. You were on duty during the Carter incident. In your opinion, was the response time adequate? Landry's eyes darted between Rawlings and Martinez, Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed. The protocol says we wait for sufficient backup when multiple inmates are involved. That wasn't my question, Martinez replied calmly. Was the response time adequate to prevent serious injury? Landry's gaze shifted briefly to Malik's bandaged face. No, ma'am, it wasn't. Rawlings stiffened. Martinez nodded, as if confirming something to herself. Thank you for your honesty, Officer Landry. She turned back to Malik. Mr. Carter, my office is reviewing all cases with contested circumstances. I suggest you make an appointment with my legal team. With that, she continued her inspection, leaving behind a wake of unspoken implications. Captain Morris followed, shooting a warning glance at Rawlings. Fucking reformers, Rawlings muttered once they were out of earshot. 6 months and she'll... Be gone. They always are. Malik said nothing as Rawlings escorted him back to his cell. The interaction had revealed valuable information. Martinez was directly challenging the established order. Landry had a conscience that could be leveraged, and Grayson's grip on the prison was being tested. All useful pieces for what would come next. In the guards' locker room that evening, Ray Grayson held court. 6 veteran officers, men who'd built careers on Grayson's system of controlled violence and selective enforcement, gathered around as he outlined the threat Martinez posed. She's pulling appeal files, questioning response protocols, talking about rehabilitation metrics. Grayson's voice dripped contempt on the final words. This isn't your standard administrative reshuffling. She's looking to make examples. Bill Rawlings leaned against a locker, arms crossed. Morris says she's got friends in the governor's office, some kind of prison reform task force backing her. Politics, Grayson spat. They send these crusaders in to appease the bleeding hearts, then wonder why discipline goes to shit. Remember Attica? Starts with reforms, ends with dead guards. The specter of prison riots, the correctional officer's ultimate nightmare, had the intended effect. Faces hardened with resolve. So what's the play? Asked Simmons, a stocky guard with 20 years on the job. Simple. We document everything. Every infraction. Every suspicious movement. Grayson's voice dropped to a conspiratorial tone. Focus on the troublemakers. Carter, Washington, Santos. Build paper trails. By the time Martinez's review team, Gets to them, there'll be so many citations they'll look like the terrorists they are. Carter's appeal is already flagged, Rawlings offered. She asked about it specifically. Grayson's jaw tightened. Then Carter needs a special reminder of how the system works. Jenkins, your brother still work in receiving? Officer Jenkins nodded. Good. I need a package processed. Grayson's eyes glittered with cold purpose. Time to make sure our jailhouse lawyer gets disbarred. The meeting dispersed with a sense of reinforced solidarity, the brotherhood of the badge-circling wagons. None of them noticed Jake Landry lingering by the shower area, a towel draped over his shoulder, absorbing every word. The next morning, Cell Block D underwent a random inspection. A dozen guards swept through, tearing apart cells with methodical precision. The usual contraband appeared: homemade alcohol, crude weapons, unauthorized medication. Then came the shouted discovery from Malik's cell. Check this out. Jenkins held up a small package wrapped in electrical tape, hidden in Carter's mattress. Grayson pushed through the gathered guards, face arranged in an expression of professional concern. Open it up. Jenkins unwrapped the package to reveal a sharpened metal shank and a small bag of white powder. The setup was obvious to every inmate watching. The package was too neatly wrapped, too conveniently placed. But in Coldwater, truth was whatever those with keys said it was. Looks like heroin and a weapon. Grayson shook his head with mock disappointment. And just when your appeal was under review, Carter, hate to see it. Malik stood impassively as Grayson documented the evidence. This move was expected, crude but effective. A weapons and drug violation would halt any appeal review, potentially add years to his sentence. The perfect defensive play from a man who understood how to weaponize bureaucracy. You'll be facing disciplinary action, Grayson informed him, with barely contained satisfaction. Segregation pending investigation. Officer Landry, escort the prisoner to admin. As Jake Landry cuffed him, Malik noticed something unexpected. The young officer's hands were trembling slightly, his eyes avoiding Grayson's. The walk to administrative segregation was silent until they turned the corner into an empty corridor. I saw them plant it, Landry whispered, voice barely audible. Jenkins coming from receiving with that package before the search. Malik kept walking, giving no indication he'd heard. You telling me this why, Officer Landry? Because it's wrong. Landry's voice strengthened slightly. This isn't what I signed up for. What did you sign up for? Malik asked, genuinely curious. To protect people. All people. Noble. Malik allowed himself a small, bitter smile. But this is Coldwater. Noble gets corrected quick. Landry fell silent as they approached the admin building. Just before they entered, he murmured, I'm filing a report about what I saw. Official channels. Official channels run through Grayson, Malik replied quietly. Remember that. The processing into segregation was routine, exchange of uniform, confiscation of personal items, assignment to a bare cell half the size of his regular accommodation. As the door clanged shut, Malik surveyed his new temporary home. Concrete. Bunk, stainless steel toilet, a sliver of a window too high to see through. 23 hours a day in this box, 1 hour for exercise. Standard procedure for awaiting disciplinary hearings. Standard procedure, but a tactical error on Grayson's part. Segregation removed Malik from general population, but it also removed him from Grayson's direct surveillance. Here, in this quietest corner of Coldwater, Malik could think without watching his back. And Landry's unexpected confession had provided the first real lever in his emerging plan. 3 days into Malik's segregation, Big Dre received a visitor in the general visitation area. His niece, Shanice, made the 2-hour drive from Montgomery each month, bringing updates on family and the world beyond Coldwater's walls. Uncle, Andre, she greeted him with the warm smile that reminded him of his sister. You look tired. Just the usual, baby girl. Dre settled his bulk into the plastic chair. How's school? They spoke of ordinary things. Her nursing classes, her son's little league games, the rising cost of gas. To the observing guard, It was a routine family visit. But halfway through, Shanice casually mentioned a mutual acquaintance. Ran into Malik's sister at the grocery store. She's worried sick, can't get any information about why he's in segregation. Asked if you might know anything. Dre's expression remained neutral, but his mind sharpened. This was no coincidence. Malik's sister lived in Atlanta, not Montgomery. Tell her not to worry. Malik's just taking some quiet time. Thinking about that investment opportunity we discussed. Says it's looking better all the time. Shanice nodded, seamlessly continuing their mundane conversation. But the message had been received. Malik was proceeding with whatever plan he'd hinted at before. Later that evening, as D-Block settled into its nighttime routine, Dre passed the word to his lieutenants. Keep eyes on the new guard, Landry. Carter thinks he might be worth something. Worth something how? Asked Terrell, Dre's second-in-command. Boy looks soft as butter. Sometimes soft is useful, Dre replied. Depends what you're building. Terrell seemed skeptical. Carter's been gunning for Grayson for years, got nowhere. Now he's in the hole, appeal's probably dead, and he thinks a rookie guard is going to help. Dre considered this, weighing his response carefully. He'd survived 20 years of a life sentence by knowing when to act and when to observe. Malik's sudden confidence, despite worsening circumstances, suggested either delusion or a genuine opportunity. Carter's smart, he said finally. Too smart to waste 12 years planning just to fail now. Smart don't mean shit against Grayson, Terrell countered. Man's untouchable. Got half the guard scared and the other half corrupt. Dre watched the evening guard patrol pass. Officer Jenkins and Officer Simmons, both from Grayson's inner circle, their postures radiating the casual arrogance of unchecked authority. Nobody's untouchable forever, Dre said quietly. You watch. Something's changing. In the warden's office, Ellen Martinez reviewed the disciplinary report on Malik Carter with narrowed eyes. Across her desk sat Captain Morris, a 20-year upper Coldwater veteran who'd managed to maintain a reputation for relative fairness. This is convenient timing, she observed, tapping the folder. Carter's appeal gets flagged, and suddenly he's caught with contraband he's never possessed before. Morris shifted uncomfortably. Grayson's report is thorough. Chain of evidence is documented. I'm sure it is. Martinez leaned back in her chair. Did you know I spent 3 years in internal affairs before this appointment? You develop a nose for manufactured cases. Warden, with respect, accusing an officer like Grayson without solid evidence would create serious problems with the staff. The guards' union would... I'm not accusing anyone yet, Captain. She closed the folder. I'm simply noting patterns, and I've seen this pattern before. A prisoner files appeals, makes waves, suddenly acquires serious violations. Morris said nothing, his silence its own form of confirmation. I want the disciplinary hearing postponed, Martinez continued. Officially, it's due to scheduling conflicts. Unofficially, I want more time to review Carter's complete record. She fixed Morris with a steady gaze. And I want Officer Landry assigned to my security detail. Landry? He's barely out of training. Precisely. He hasn't had time to be integrated into the Coldwater system. The implication hung in the air between them. Morris nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. It won't just be Carter, you know, he said quietly. If you're really going after the systemic issues here, there's 12 years of accumulated practices to untangle. I know exactly what I'm doing, Captain. Martinez's voice held the steel that had propelled her through the ranks of a system designed to exclude her. Coldwater isn't my first reform project, but I hope it will be my most thorough. As Morris left her office, Martinez turned to the window overlooking the prison yard. In the distance, she could see Cell Block D, Grayson's personal fiefdom within the larger kingdom of Coldwater. The first cracks were appearing in his armor, but Martinez harbored no illusions about the difficulty ahead. Challenging men like Ray Grayson meant confronting not just individuals but institutions, the entrenched culture of punishment over rehabilitation, of control through fear. She had political backing for now, but that could evaporate with one serious incident. One escaped prisoner, one guard injury. She needed allies inside the system. Morris was cautious but reasonable. Landry showed promise. And then there was Carter, a man whose case file revealed an intelligence and persistence that 12 years of oppression had failed to break. Martinez returned to her desk and opened Carter's original case file. If she was going to use him as a wedge against Coldwater's corrupt foundation, she needed to be certain he was what he claimed, a man wronged by the very system she was sworn to reform. After 7 days in segregation, Malik was released back to general population. The official reason: pending further investigation of evidence. The real reason was clear to anyone watching the shifting landscape of Coldwater. Warden Martinez was systematically disrupting Grayson's established procedures. Malik stepped back into cell block D with careful observation. The atmosphere had changed subtly during his absence, tension humming beneath the surface like an electrical current. Guards patrolled in pairs now, radio chatter more frequent. Inmates clustered in their respective racial groups, conversations hushed. "Welcome back to paradise," Big Dre commented as Malik took his usual spot in the common area. "Heard your vacation got cut short." "Warden's orders," Malik replied quietly. "Seems she's taking a personal interest in Grayson's disciplinary reports." Dre nodded slightly. "Message received, by the way. But I'm still not convinced this plays out how you think." "It doesn't need to." Malik's voice remained low. "It just needs to start playing out." Their conversation ended as Officer Jenkins approached, deliberately slapping his baton against his palm. "Touching reunion. Break it up. Separate tables for separate groups." The racist implication hung in the air, but neither inmate reacted. Jenkins lingered a moment longer, hoping for resistance that would justify force, then moved on with a disappointed scowl. "Tonight," Malik murmured as they parted. "Krebs, laundry room." Dre raised an eyebrow but asked no questions. Questions could be overheard. Questions could be used. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that day, Malik found himself randomly assigned to laundry duty, a job normally reserved for trusted trustees. The supervisor, a civilian employee named Mac who cared more about efficiency than prison politics, simply handed him a cart of dirty uniforms and pointed to the industrial washers. As Malik sorted through the uniforms, he noted the name tags: Krebs, Dayton, Willis, all Brotherhood members. The assignment wasn't random at all. It was Grayson's way of engineering another confrontation, this time in the relatively isolated laundry facility where accidents frequently occurred. Right on schedule, Kurt Krebs sauntered in, flanked by 2 of his Brotherhood soldiers. The leader of Coldwater's white supremacist faction, had the over-muscled physique of someone who'd spent most of his 15-year sentence in the weight pit. Crude swastika and lightning bolt tattoos covered his arms and neck. "Well, look who's touching my clothes," Krebs sneered. "Feeling better after our little talk in the yard, Carter?" Malik continued sorting, not looking up. "Just doing the job they assigned me." "Job's about to get harder." Krebs moved closer, positioning himself between Malik and the exit. His associates spread out, creating a triangulation pattern Malik had seen before. But instead of tensing for a fight, Malik asked quietly, "You ever wonder why Grayson always sends you to do his dirty work?" Krebs hesitated, thrown by the unexpected question. "What?" "Grayson, using you like his personal attack dog." Malik finally looked up, his gaze steady. "He's playing you." "You don't know what you're talking about," Krebs growled. But the hesitation remained. "Check your disciplinary record against mine," Malik continued calmly. "You've caught 3 assault charges doing his bidding. I bet he promised to help with your parole board, right? Yet here you are, 15 years into a 12-year sentence." Uncertainty flickered across Krebs's face, quickly masked by anger. "Shut your mouth. Martinez is reviewing all parole denials." Malik returned to sorting uniforms. Grayson knows he can't stop her, so he's creating distractions, and you're his favorite distraction. This some kind of mind game? Krebs stepped closer, fists clenched. It's mathematics, Malik replied. Risk versus reward. You take all the risk attacking me. Grayson gets all the reward when you're denied parole again. Simple equation. One of Krebs's associates shifted uncomfortably. Man's got a point, Kurt. Your last parole hearing? Shut up, Krebs snapped, but his conviction was wavering. Malik finished sorting the uniforms, then looked directly at Krebs. You want to hurt me? Go ahead. But ask yourself who really benefits from you catching another assault charge. The tension stretched between them, a rubber band pulled to its limit. Then, unexpectedly, Krebs stepped back. This isn't finished, he muttered, but the threat sounded hollow. Never said it was. Malik turned to the washing machines. Your uniforms will be ready by dinner. After they left, Malik allowed himself a small smile. The seed was planted, not peace with the Brotherhood, but doubt about Grayson. In Coldwater's delicate ecosystem, doubt was corrosive to loyalty. Jake Landry stood at attention in Warden Martinez's office, uncomfortable under her direct scrutiny. His starched uniform felt too tight, his collar chafing against his neck. At ease, Officer Landry, Martinez said, gesturing to a chair. This isn't a formal review. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied, perching nervously on the edge of the seat. His mind raced through possible reasons for the summons. Had Grayson discovered his aborted report about the planted contraband? I've been reviewing the incident reports from your first week, Martinez began, leafing through a folder. You were present during the yard assault on Inmate Carter. Yes, ma'am. And during the cell search that discovered contraband in his possession. Jake's throat tightened. Yes, ma'am. Martinez closed the folder and fixed him with a steady gaze. Officer Landry, would you say these reports accurately reflect what you witnessed? The question hung in the air like a trap. Jake felt sweat beading at his hairline as he weighed his options. The truth could end his career before it began. Lying would make him complicit in a system he was increasingly uncomfortable with. He began, then stopped. The reports contain factual inaccuracies, Warden. Martinez's expression didn't change, but something in her posture relaxed slightly. Specifically, the yard incident. Jake found his courage building with each word. The report states a 5-minute response time. It was closer to 2 minutes, with officers deliberately delaying intervention. And the contraband? Jake hesitated only briefly. I saw Officer Jenkins enter Carter's cell with a package before the search began. The search pattern was targeted, not random as reported. Martinez nodded, making a note. Why are you telling me this, Officer Landry? You must know there could be consequences. My father was a cop for 30 years, Jake said, surprising himself with his forthrightness. He always said the badge means you hold the line, not that you get to move the line where it suits you. A ghost of a smile crossed Martinez's face. Admirable philosophy, not always popular in places like Coldwater. I'm learning that, ma'am. Martinez closed her notebook. I'm assigning you to administrative duties through next week. Officially, it's to help process the backlog of appeals. Reviews. Unofficially, it keeps you away from Officer Grayson while I pursue these inconsistencies. Relief and apprehension mingled in Jake's chest. He'll know I talked to you. Probably, Martinez agreed. But that's my problem, not yours. Do your job, keep your eyes open, and remember your father's philosophy. She stood, signaling the end of their meeting. The line needs holding at Coldwater, Officer Landry. I'm glad to have people who understand that. In the officer's break room, Ray Grayson paced like a caged predator. The morning briefing had delivered unwelcome news. Martinez had reassigned 3 of his most loyal officers to perimeter duty, replaced Jake Landry with a veteran from another block, and scheduled a comprehensive review of all incident reports from the past 6 months. She's making a move, he muttered to Rawlings, who slouched in a chair nursing cold coffee, testing how far she can push. Morris says to play it cool, Rawlings replied. Weather the storm. These reform types burn out fast. Grayson slammed his palm against a locker. By the time she burns out, we'll all be reassigned or worse. She's building a case, targeting my report specifically. What about the contraband in Carter's cell? She's reviewing the evidence chain. Grayson mimicked Martinez's precise diction. And I'd bet my pension that rookie Landry squealed about Jenkins. Rawlings straightened, suddenly more alert. Landry's talking to her? Kid's been here, what, 2 weeks? Young, idealistic, probably thinks he's on some crusade for justice. Grayson's face darkened. We need to remind him how things really work around here. Before Rawlings could respond, they were interrupted by Officer Simmons rushing in, radio crackling with urgent transmissions. Fight in the cafeteria, he reported breathlessly. C and D blocks. It's bad, Ray. Grayson was already moving. Who? Big Dre's crew and some of the Hispanic guys. Started over nothing, somebody bumped someone in the food line. Coldwater's rigid racial segregation made any cross-group conflict potentially explosive. By the time Grayson reached the cafeteria, the situation had escalated beyond a typical prison scuffle. Nearly 30 inmates were engaged in a chaotic brawl, makeshift weapons already in play. "Lock it down!" Grayson roared, as guards rushed to secure exits and call for backup. He waded into the periphery of the fight, baton at ready, looking for the instigators. He spotted Big Dre standing, back from the melee, arms crossed, watching with unsettling calm. Their eyes met across the room, and Dre gave him a small nod, a gesture so incongruous that Grayson faltered. In that moment of distraction, a food tray swung by a faceless inmate connected with the back of Grayson's head. He staggered momentarily, dazed as the chaos swirled around him. Through blurred vision, he saw something else unexpected. Kurt Krebs and his brotherhood, traditionally quick to join any violence, remained seated at their table, deliberately uninvolved. The response: team arrived in full riot gear, deploying pepper spray and flashbangs to subdue the fighters. As order was gradually restored, Grayson took inventory of the damage: 14 inmates requiring medical attention, 3 guards with minor injuries, and a crippling sense that he'd somehow been outmaneuvered. In the aftermath of what became known as the cafeteria riot, Coldwater entered lockdown. Inmates were confined to cells, meals delivered on trays, all privileges suspended. The official investigation identified no clear cause for the unusually coordinated violence. Malik, watching from his cell as guards conducted endless counts and searches, understood what others didn't. The riot had been a test, not of Grayson's security measures, but of his control over the prison's racial dynamics, the carefully cultivated tensions he exploited to maintain order. For the first time, those tensions had ignited without his direction and burned beyond his ability to contain. On the 3rd day of lockdown, Martinez conducted an inspection of D Block, accompanied by Captain Morris and, surprisingly, Jake Landry. As they passed Malik's cell, Martinez paused briefly. "Mr. Carter, my office will be reviewing your case next week. I'd like you to prepare a statement regarding your original conviction and subsequent appeals." Before he could respond, she continued, down the tier. But the message had been delivered in full view of the other inmates and, more importantly, within earshot of Officer Jenkins, who would certainly report to Grayson. That evening, as lockdown protocols temporarily relaxed to allow showers, Malik found himself in the bathroom area at the same time as Big Dre. "Your move worked," Dre murmured over the sound of running water. Grayson lost face with the Brotherhood. "Word is they refused to jump in when he gave the signal." "Just the beginning," Malik replied quietly. "Martinez is reviewing my case. Officially." Dre's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "Krebs been asking questions about Grayson's promises, comparing notes with some of the other whites about parole denials. Seems your little chat in the laundry room got him thinking." "Good. Keep pushing that angle. Every man in here who's been denied parole under Grayson's watch needs to start connecting those dots." "You're playing a dangerous game," Dre warned. "Martinez might be for real, but reforms come and go. Grayson's kind, they outlast everything." "Not this time." Malik's voice hardened. We just need to keep the pressure building. Next phase starts tomorrow. You ready? Dre studied him for a long moment, weighing 12 years of caution against the unmistakable shift in Coldwater's power. Structure. Finally, he nodded. Ready, but if this backfires... It won't. Malik cut him off. Grayson's already making mistakes. He doesn't understand what's happening yet. By the time he figures it out, it'll be too late. The administrative office, where Jake Landry had been reassigned, was quiet compared to the constant tension of the cell blocks. His task, organizing appeal files for Martinez's review team, gave him unusual access to Coldwater's paper trail of injustice. As he sorted through decades of denied appeals, patterns emerged. Certain officers' names appeared repeatedly in rejection justifications. Ray Grayson's signature featured prominently on an overwhelming number of negative recommendations, especially for black inmates. When Jake reached Malik Carter's file, he paused. Unlike most inmate records, which grew thin after years of institutional neglect, Carter's bulged with meticulously documented appeals, each more comprehensive than the last. The original case file contained troubling inconsistencies. Witness. Statements that contradicted each other. Evidence collected under questionable circumstances. A public defender who'd spent less than 3 hours on the case before recommending a plea deal. Doing some extracurricular reading, Officer Landry? Jake startled at Warden Martinez's voice. He hadn't heard her enter the records room. Just organizing for the review team, ma'am, he replied, closing Carter's file. There's a lot to process. Indeed. Martinez took a seat across from him. Having worked in 3 different facilities, I can tell you that Coldwater's denial rate for appeals and parole is nearly double the state average, particularly for certain demographics. Jake hesitated, then decided to risk honesty. I've noticed Officer Grayson's name on a disproportionate number of denial recommendations. As have I. Martinez tapped the stack of files. What's more interesting is how many of those denials cite disciplinary infractions that occurred just before scheduled reviews. Like the contraband in Carter's cell, Jake said quietly. Precisely. Martinez studied him thoughtfully. Carter's case is particularly egregious. 11 years of exemplary behavior, followed by a series of suspicious incidents, each coinciding with appeal or parole considerations. If you know all this, Jake asked, why not act directly? Transfer Grayson at least. Martinez smiled grimly. Prison administration isn't that simple. Grayson has allies throughout the system, the guards, union, friends in the Department of Corrections, connections with the previous administration. I need irrefutable evidence of systematic abuses, not isolated incidents. Jake considered this, then made a decision that would irrevocably alter his path at Coldwater. I can help with that. There's a pattern to how Grayson operates. I've seen enough to document it. That could put your career at risk, Martinez warned. With respect, Warden, I think my career was at risk the moment I decided I couldn't look the other way. Jake straightened the files with deliberate care. My father always said the hardest thing about wearing a badge is holding other badges accountable. Martinez nodded, a new respect in her eyes. Start with Carter's case. Build me a timeline of incidents versus appeal activities. And Officer Landry. She paused at the door. Keep this between us for now. The walls at Coldwater have ears. As lockdown restrictions gradually eased, Ray Grayson found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts. Martinez's review team had pulled dozens of case files. Inmate grievances previously buried were resurfacing, and for the first time in his 15-year tenure, he'd been formally counseled about his excessive use of forced documentation. Most disturbing was the subtle shift in inmate dynamics. The Brotherhood, once reliable allies in maintaining the racial balance of power, had grown strangely unresponsive to his usual channels of communication. Krebs had even filed a formal request for parole reconsideration, a direct challenge to Grayson's previous denials. It's like they're working together, he confided to Rawlings as they monitored the yard from the guard station. Not just the inmates, Martinez, Morris, that kid Landry, all pushing at the same time. You're getting paranoid, Rawlings replied, but without conviction. He too had noticed the changing atmosphere. "Look at that." Grayson nodded toward the yard where Malik Carter sat at a table with two older white inmates, both serving long sentences, both repeatedly denied parole under Grayson's recommendations. Carter never associates outside his race. Now suddenly he's having book club with Richards and Kowalski? "They're just talking," Rawlings said, "not against regulations." "They're not just talking. They're comparing notes." Grayson's knuckles whitened as he gripped the railing. "I need to shut this down before it gets any further. Get Jenkins and Simmons. We're doing a random drug test on Carter. Today." Rawlings hesitated, uncharacteristically cautious. "Martinez is watching your report specifically. Maybe we should—" "Are you with me or not?" Grayson cut him off, eyes cold with determination. 12 years I've kept this place under control. 12 years of knowing which buttons to push, which pressure to apply. I'm not losing that because some reform-minded warden wants to play social justice." After a long moment, Rawlings nodded. "I'm with you. Always have been." But as he went to gather the other officers, Rawlings couldn't shake the feeling that they were crossing a line, not the ethical line they'd crossed years ago, but a tactical one. For the first time, he wondered if Ray Grayson, the unshakable force at Coldwater's center, might have finally met his match in the combined pressure of Martinez's authority and Malik Carter's patient resistance. The balance of power was shifting, incrementally but inexorably. And Rawlings, pragmatist that he was, had begun calculating which side of that shift he needed to be on when it finally tipped beyond recovery. Pre-dawn at Coldwater was a liminal space, the night shift guards drowsy, the day shift not yet arrived, inmates still locked in dreams or insomnia. In this gray hour, Ray Grayson strode purposefully through the administrative wing, a manila folder tucked under his arm. His face, usually a mask of controlled authority, betrayed unusual tension at the corners of his mouth. Captain Morris looked up from his desk, surprised by the early visit. "Ray, shift doesn't start for another hour. Got something that needs immediate processing." Grayson slid the folder across the desk. "Transfer authorization for Malik Carter, signed by the DOC regional director yesterday." Morris opened the folder, eyebrows rising as he scanned the document. "Transfer to Hammett Correctional? That's 300 miles north, medium security." He looked up suspiciously. "How'd you arrange this?" "Called in some favors." Grayson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Carter's been classified as a disruptive influence. Documentation's all there. Safety concerns, gang associations, the works. Martinez won't like this. She specifically mentioned Carter's case. Martinez doesn't need to approve it." Grayson tapped the signature at the bottom of the form. "Regional has authority to transfer for security reasons. By the time she gets in this morning, Carter will be halfway to Hammett." Morris hesitated, shrewd eyes studying Grayson. In 15 years of working together, he'd never seen the senior guard this desperate. "This feels rushed, Ray." "It's necessary," Grayson replied, voice hardening. "Carter's been orchestrating dissent, turning inmates against each other, against the staff. You saw what happened in the cafeteria. That was him, working through Washington and others. You have proof of that?" "I know how he operates." Grayson leaned forward, dropping his voice. "Look, Carl, we both know Martinez is on some crusade. She's looking to make examples, build her reform credentials. Carter's feeding her exactly what she wants to hear. If he stays, we're all exposed." The implication hung in the air between them. Morris, despite his relative fairness, had been at Coldwater long enough to be implicated in its systemic problems, if not through action, then through silence. "Transport's scheduled for 5:30, Grayson continued. "I've got Jenkins and Simmons handling it. Need your sign-off to process him out." After a long moment, Morris nodded and initialed the transfer order. "I hope you know what you're doing, Ray." "Protecting all of us," Grayson replied, taking back the folder. "That's what I've always done." As Grayson left, Morris sat motionless, staring at the phone on his desk. Warden Martinez had given him direct instructions to inform her of any unusual movements regarding key inmates. but calling her now meant openly choosing sides in a battle he'd hoped to avoid. The captain rubbed his tired eyes, then reached for the phone. Not to call Martinez, but to request Officer Jake Landry report for administrative duty. Immediately, Jake Landry hurried through the dimly lit corridors, mind racing with possibilities. A pre-dawn summons from Captain Morris could mean anything, none of it likely good. Had Grayson discovered his cooperation with Martinez? Was he being reassigned? Terminated? He found Morris alone in his office, looking grave. "Sir, you wanted to see me?" Morris gestured for him to close the door. "Landry, I'm assigning you to process some transfer paperwork. Immediate priority." He slid a folder across the desk, the same one Grayson had delivered earlier. "Everything needs to be entered in the system and verification calls made." Jake opened the folder, surprise registering when he saw Malik Carter's name. "Transfer to Hammett?" "That's right." Morris watched him carefully. "Authorized by Regional. Needs to be processed for 5:30 transport." Jake's eyes caught the freshly initialed approval, Morris's own mark. "I don't understand. Warden Martinez is reviewing his case personally." "The warden doesn't supersede regional security directives." Morris's expression remained unreadable. "Process the paperwork, Officer Landry." Jake hesitated, detecting something unspoken in the captain's tone. Should I inform Warden Martinez?" "The warden gets in at 7. Transport leaves at 5:30. Morris stood up, moving toward the door. "I need coffee. Probably take me 15 minutes to get it from the staff room. Processing should be complete when I return." He paused at the door, meeting Jake's confused gaze with significant intensity. "Everything by the book, Landry. Cross every T, dot every I. Understand?" Comprehension dawned slowly. Morris wasn't just giving him an assignment. He was giving him an opportunity. "Yes, sir, everything by the book." Alone in the office, Jake reviewed the transfer documents with growing alarm. The justification was a patchwork of exaggerated incidents and outright fabrications. Malik Carter was described as a gang leader, an inciter of violence, a manipulation risk. The signature of the regional director looked genuine, but the date beside it had been altered, changed from what appeared to be next week to yesterday. Jake knew what he should do as a correctional officer: process the paperwork as instructed, enabling a transfer that would effectively neutralize an inmate who threatened Grayson's control. But he also knew what he should do as the person he'd always believed himself to be: prevent an obvious abuse of power. With trembling hands, he began making the required calls to verify the transfer. With each call, he deliberately introduced small but critical errors: transposing numbers in Carter's inmate ID, misstating the security classification, requesting confirmation for the wrong date. By the time Morris returned, Jake had created a tangle of bureaucratic confusion that would take hours to unravel, hours that would delay the transfer until after Martinez arrived. "Paperwork's processed, sir," Jake reported, heart pounding so loudly he was certain Morris could hear it. But there seemed to be some discrepancies in the verification. Hammett is requesting clarification on the security status and transport protocols. Morris took the folder, leafing through Jake's meticulous notes of the problems encountered. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Bureaucracy," he sighed heavily. "Always something. I'll inform Officer Grayson there may be a delay." As Jake turned to leave, Morris added quietly, "Good work, Officer Landry, very thorough." The acknowledgement confirmed Jake's suspicion. Captain Morris had given him the assignment precisely because he'd expected him to find a way to sabotage it. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. He now had an ally, but he'd also crossed a line from which there was no return. Malik was awakened by the harsh beam of a flashlight through the bars of his cell. "On your feet, Carter." Grayson's voice carried unusual urgency. "Hands out for cuffs." Instantly alert, Malik complied without question. Years of survival instinct, overriding curiosity. Only when the cell door slid open and he saw both Grayson and Jenkins waiting did he understand. Something non-routine was happening. "What's this about?" he asked as Jenkins secured the handcuffs with unnecessary tightness. "Transfer," Grayson replied. satisfaction evident in his tone. "Hammett Correctional, your new home." Malik kept his expression neutral despite the surge of alarm. Grayson was removing him from the equation, sending him far from Martinez's investigation, from the network he'd carefully built, from any chance at exposing the truth. "Reason for transfer?" he asked, playing for time as they escorted him down the silent tier. "Security concerns," Grayson smirked. "You've been deemed a destabilizing influence. Regional office signed off personally." As they passed the common area, a shadowy figure moved in a cell. Big Dre, awake and watching. Their eyes met briefly, a silent exchange of understanding. Then Jenkins shoved Malik forward, breaking the contact. In the processing area, Jake Landry was waiting, his presence unexpected. The young officer avoided eye contact as Jenkins began the intake procedure. "Strip search," Jenkins ordered. Then new transport uniform. The humiliation was deliberate. Grayson watching as Malik was forced to undress, Jenkins's rough handling during the search, the too small uniform provided for transport. Throughout, Jake remained silent, apparently focused on paperwork. "Transport vehicles having mechanical issues," Jake finally said, still not looking up. "Dispatch says at least an hour delay." Grayson's face darkened. "That's unacceptable. We need him out before shift change." "I've called maintenance," Jake replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing I can do about the vehicle." "Put him in holding," Grayson ordered Jenkins. "I'll make some calls." In the small holding cell, little more than a cage with a bench, Malik sat motionless, mind working through scenarios. Grayson's desperation was telling. He was accelerating his timeline, taking risks. That created opportunities, but only if Malik could remain at Coldwater. Minutes stretched into an hour. Through the small window in the processing area door, Malik could see Grayson engaged in increasingly tense phone conversations. Jenkins paced nervously. Jake continued processing paperwork with deliberate slowness. Then the door opened and Captain Morris entered, followed by a familiar figure that made Malik's pulse quicken. Warden Martinez. "Officer Grayson," Martinez's voice cut through the room like ice. "Explain why I'm learning about an inmate transfer from Captain Morris instead of through proper channels." Grayson straightened, adapting smoothly. "Emergency security transfer, Warden. Regional authorization. Given Carter's involvement in recent disturbances, it was deemed prudent to expedite the process." Recent disturbances. Martinez approached the holding cell, studying Malik briefly before turning back to Grayson. "You mean the cafeteria incident for which no one has been formally charged due to inconclusive evidence?" "Among other concerns." Grayson gestured to the folder on the desk. "It's all documented. Signed by Regional Director Harmon yesterday." Martinez picked up the folder, examining it carefully. "Interesting. I spoke with Director Harmon last night regarding administrative reviews. He mentioned nothing about this." "It was processed late," Grayson replied, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. "And appears to contain numerous procedural errors," Martinez continued, leafing through the pages. "Inconsistent dates, mismatched security classifications, incorrect inmate identification numbers." She looked up at Jake. "Officer Landry, you processed this paperwork?" Jake swallowed visibly. "Yes, ma'am. I noticed the discrepancies during verification. Was attempting to resolve them before transport." "I see." Martinez closed the folder decisively. "This transfer is suspended pending full review. Captain Morris, please escort inmate Carter back to his cell. Officer Grayson, my office now." As Morris led him out, Malik caught a final glimpse of Grayson's face, the mask of control slipping to reveal something Malik had waited 12 years to see. Fear. Word of the thwarted transfer spread through Coldwater with the efficiency of all prison communications, whispered between cells, passed in the yard, exchanged through trustee runners. By lunchtime, the prevailing narrative had crystallized. Grayson had tried to disappear Malik Carter, and the warden had shut him down. In the cafeteria, Big Dre watched the subtle shift in dynamics with a practiced eye. Inmates who normally kept their heads down, were engaged in hushed conversations. Guards appeared uncertain, clustering together rather than maintaining their usual authoritative distance. And Grayson was conspicuously absent. When Malik entered, there was a momentary hush followed by a murmur of recognition. He moved through the line with his customary quiet dignity, but something had changed. Inmates nodded to him, made space, offered small gestures of acknowledgement. "You survived," Dre commented as Malik took a seat opposite him. "Impressive." "Wasn't me," Malik replied softly. Landry and Morris intervened. Martinez showed up before Grayson could push it through. Dre absorbed this information, reassessing his mental map of Coldwater's power structure. "So the captain's choosing sides. Interesting." "He's hedging his bets," Malik corrected, "protecting his position regardless of who wins." "And the young guard? Landry? He's committed now." Malik glanced toward the guard station where Jake stood watching the room, his posture tense but resolute. "Grayson will come after him for this." Dre nodded slowly. "So what now? Grayson's desperate, which makes him dangerous. Now we accelerate." Malik lowered his voice further. "You have the package?" "Got it this morning. Visitor passed it clean, but using it means no going back." We passed no going back the moment Martinez arrived. Malik's eyes hardened with 12 years of accumulated purpose. "Grayson tried to remove me from the equation. Now we remove him." Dre studied him for a long moment, weighing decades of prison caution against the unmistakable opportunity before them. "The Brotherhood's on board. Krebs got his parole review scheduled. He thinks Martinez pulled strings. He's ready to talk about how Grayson's been running things." "Good. Get it to Martinez. Everything. The contraband system, the documentation falsification, the selective enforcement." Malik's voice remained calm, but intensity radiated from him. 12 years of evidence delivered as a unified statement from both sides of the racial divide. "And when Grayson retaliates, because he will." "That's what we want," Malik replied. "His retaliation will be his downfall, but we need insurance, something undeniable on record." Dre's eyebrows raised slightly. "What kind of insurance?" "Jake can access the security system. We need to ensure certain cameras are working at specific times." "That's playing with fire," Dre warned. "Using a guard that, okay, he's already in. Martinez has him documenting Grayson's patterns for her investigation." Malik's gaze was unflinching. "But administrative reviews take time. We need Grayson to expose himself now before he can regroup." A moment of silence stretched between them as Dre considered the implications. Finally, he nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'm in, all the way." Malik extended his hand across the table, a simple gesture that carried enormous significance in Coldwater's restrictive social hierarchy. Dre clasped it firmly, cementing an alliance that transcended the prison's ruthlessly enforced racial boundaries. Across the cafeteria, Officer Jenkins observed the handshake with narrowed eyes, immediately reaching for his radio. In the administrative wing, Warden Martinez faced Ray Grayson across her desk, their confrontation reaching its crescendo. "Falsified transfer documentation is a serious offense, Officer Grayson. One that could end your career." Grayson maintained his composure with visible effort. "With respect, Warden, there was no falsification. Any errors were clerical, likely introduced during Officer Landry's processing." "Convenient," Martinez Wano replied coldly. "Just as it's convenient that an inmate whose case I'm personally reviewing was suddenly deemed a security risk requiring immediate transfer. Carter manipulates the system. He always has." Grayson leaned forward. "He's playing you, Warden, creating a narrative of victimization while orchestrating disruptions throughout the facility. Your concern is noted." Martinez's tone made clear how little weight his assessment carried. "Nevertheless, Inmate Carter remains at Coldwater pending completion of my review, and you, Officer Grayson, are hereby placed on administrative leave." The blood drained from Grayson's face. "Administrative leave? On what grounds?" Pending investigation of procedural violations related to transfer processing, inappropriate application of disciplinary measures, and potential civil rights concerns. Martinez slid a formal notice across the desk. Effective immediately. You'll surrender your credentials to Captain Morris before leaving the premises. Grayson stared at the paper, momentarily speechless. Then his professional mask slipped, revealing the raw fury beneath. 12 years I've kept this place from exploding. 12 years of handling the worst offenders in the state system. You've been here, what, 3 weeks? You have no idea what it takes to maintain order in a place like Coldwater. Order or control, Martinez countered. There's a difference, Officer Grayson. One I intend to establish here. Grayson stood abruptly. You're making a mistake. Carter is not who you think he is. Neither, it appears, are you? Martinez remained seated, her calm authority a stark contrast to his barely contained rage. Captain Morris will escort you out. As he turned to leave, Grayson paused at the door. When this place erupts, and it will, remember this conversation, Warden. Some men can't be rehabilitated. Some only understand force. Then perhaps, Martinez replied evenly, it's time they understood something else. After Grayson departed, Martinez sat motionless, considering the confrontation. Despite her outward confidence, she harbored no illusions about the difficulty ahead. Removing Grayson temporarily was one thing. Building a case strong enough for permanent action was another. Without irrefutable evidence, the system would protect its own, reinstate him, possibly even promote him to demonstrate institutional solidarity. Her phone buzzed with a text from Captain Morris. Grayson out, clean exit, but his supporters are already talking. Martinez sighed. The battle lines were drawn now, with Coldwater's fragile stability hanging in the balance. She needed Malik, Carter's testimony, Jake Landry's documentation, and whatever evidence she could gather before Grayson's allies could close ranks. What she didn't yet realize was that forces were already in motion beyond her control. A convergence of vengeance and justice 12 years in the making, orchestrated by a man who had learned that sometimes the only way to break a corrupt system was to leverage its own corruption against it. Administrative leave did not mean absence. Ray Grayson might have surrendered his badge and credentials, but his presence still permeated Coldwater like a shadow. The guards loyal to him, Jenkins, Simmons, and a half-dozen others, maintained constant communication, reporting every development within the prison walls to their suspended leader. 3 days after his removal, Grayson sat in his truck in the staff parking lot, the early morning darkness providing cover as Jenkins approached, hunched against the cold. You shouldn't be here, Jenkins muttered, sliding into the passenger seat. Martinez has eyes everywhere now. This is still my prison, Grayson replied, eyes fixed on the imposing silhouette of Coldwater against the pre-dawn sky. What's the situation? Jenkins passed over a folded piece of paper. Shift rotations for the week. She's broken up your core team, split us between different blocks, different shifts. Rawlings is on perimeter duty, for Christ's sake. Grayson studied the schedule, noting the strategic separation of his allies. And Carter? That's the thing. He's been moved to the hospital wing. Medical observation is the official reason. Unofficial word is they're keeping him separated for protection while they interview him. Interview about what? Everything. Martinez has some DOJ people coming in tomorrow. Carter's case is just the starting point. They're digging into every denial, every incident report from the past 5 years. Grayson's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. 12 years of carefully maintained control, of knowing which inmates to pressure and which to reward, which guards to cultivate and which to intimidate, all of it unraveling because of one persistent inmate and an ambitious warden. And the kid? Landry? Jenkins snorted. Martinez's golden boy. Working directly with her team now, pulling files, organizing testimony. Word is he's the one who tipped her about the transfer, so he made his choice. Grayson's voice hardened. What about Morris? Playing both sides. Careful to never be alone with any of us, but not actively helping Martinez either. Waiting to see which way the wind blows. Grayson absorbed this, calculating his remaining leverage points. The Brotherhood? Washington's crew? That's the strangest part, Jenkins said, shifting uncomfortably. They're talking to each other. Not just Carter and Washington. Krebs has been meeting with them, too, in the open during yard time. Never seen anything like it. This was the most troubling development of all. The racial divisions of Coldwater had been a fundamental tool of control, predictable fault lines that could be exploited to maintain order. If those divisions were healing even temporarily, it meant something unprecedented was happening. I need back in, Grayson decided. Tomorrow, when the DOJ team arrives. How? Martinez explicitly barred you from the premises. Grayson pulled a security badge from his pocket, not his own, but one that would grant access to the administrative areas. Simmons will get me in through the service entrance. I need 20 minutes in the security office, tops. What are you planning, Ray? Jenkins asked, wariness creeping into his voice. Insurance? Grayson replied grimly. Carter thinks he's untouchable now. Time to remind him that no one inside those walls is ever truly safe. In the hospital wing, Malik sat, across from Jake Landry, their conversation masked by the hum of medical equipment. The young guard had assumed responsibility for transporting Malik to his scheduled interviews with Martinez's investigation team, creating brief windows for unsupervised communication. You're sure about this timeline? Malik asked, keeping his voice low. DOJ arrives tomorrow morning? Jake nodded. First interview scheduled for 9 a.m. Martinez is starting with you, then moving to other inmates with similar complaint patterns. And Grayson knows this schedule? Jenkins has been feeding him information. They don't know I'm aware. Jake glanced nervously at the door. He'll make a move before those interviews happen. He has to. Malik considered this, the pieces of his long-planned endgame falling into place. When you get back to the administrative wing, check the visitor log from last week. Look for anyone meeting with Grayson before the transfer attempt. Why? Because desperate men call in favors, Malik replied. Grayson didn't arrange that. Transfer alone. Someone with authority signed off even if the paperwork was flawed. Jake hesitated, then lowered his voice further. There's something else. Rawlings approached me yesterday, said he wanted to clarify some misunderstandings before the DOJ interviews. This was an unexpected development. What kind of clarification? He implied he has documentation, incident reports that were never filed, recordings of conversations with Grayson, said he was protecting his future. Malik's eyebrows rose slightly. Rawlings defecting was significant, a rat leaving a sinking ship, but a rat with valuable information. Can you arrange a meeting? Too risky. Martinez has me under close observation, thinks Grayson might target me. Jake pulled a small folded paper from his pocket. But Rawlings gave me this, said it's access information for a cloud storage account. Everything's there. Malik accepted the paper, tucking it carefully into his shoe. Big Dre needs to know about this. He's coordinating with Krebs on their statements. I can't be seen talking to Washington, Jake protested. That would raise too many flags. You won't be. Malik's expression remained calm, but his eyes conveyed the urgency. There's a trustee, Miguel Suarez, works in the infirmary. Give him a message for Dre. Rawlings is in. Cloud storage with everything. He'll understand. Their conversation ended as footsteps approached, a nurse with Malik's scheduled medication. Jake stood, resuming his professional demeanor with practiced ease. Escort back to interviews in 30 minutes, he informed the nurse, then departed with a final meaningful glance at Malik. Alone, Malik swallowed the harmless vitamins he'd been prescribed as part of his medical observation, mind working through contingencies. Grayson would make his move soon, something dramatic enough to derail Martinez's investigation. The key was to anticipate it, channel it, and ensure it became the final evidence needed to destroy him. The prison yard at Coldwater was a powder keg at the best of times. Today, with tension coursing through every interaction, it felt seconds away from detonation. Malik temporarily returned to general population for scheduled yard time, observed the scene with tactical precision. Guards positioned at elevated stations, hands resting near weapons. Inmates clustered in unusual formations, the traditional. Racial divisions blurred by new alliances formed over shared grievances against Grayson's regime. Big Dre approached casually, maintaining the appearance of a routine conversation. Message received. Rawlings came through Big, recordings of Grayson planning setups, discussing which inmates to target, how to falsify reports. Martinez has access to this evidence now? Being delivered as we speak. Krebs's outside contact is handling it. Anonymous email to her official address. Dre kept his gaze moving across the yard. But there's a complication. Jenkins was seen at the service. Entrance an hour ago, letting someone in. Word is Grayson's in the building. Malik absorbed this, recalculating. Sooner than expected, where? Security office, according to my source in maintenance. And he's accessing the camera systems. This aligned with what Malik had anticipated. Grayson, attempting to manipulate surveillance footage, create evidence of some infraction serious enough to halt Martinez's investigation. But knowing his play opened the possibility of turning it against him. The yard cameras, Malik murmured, eyes moving to the surveillance equipment mounted on the perimeter walls. He's setting something up to be recorded. Dre followed his gaze. You think he's planning to stage something here? Now? It's his last chance before the DOJ interviews. Malik spotted Jenkins and Simmons patrolling unusually close to each other, radios active. They're positioned for it, waiting for a signal. So we walk away, Dre suggested. Back inside. Don't give them the opportunity. No. Malik's decision crystallized instantly. We give them exactly what they want, but on our terms. He quickly outlined his adaptation, Dre's expression shifting from skepticism to grudging appreciation as the strategy became clear. That's playing with fire, Dre warned. If it goes wrong, it won't. Malik's certainty came from 12 years of studying his opponent, of learning how Grayson thought, how he reacted. Get Krebs on board. 2 minutes by the basketball court. Make it look real. As Dre moved away, Malik caught sight of Officer Jake Landry entering the yard, expression tense. Their eyes met briefly, Malik giving an almost imperceptible nod. Jake's slightly widened eyes indicated he understood. Something was happening. The orchestration that followed appeared spontaneous to any observer. A dispute on the basketball court, Big Dre and Kurt Krebs, longtime racial adversaries, in a heated argument over a meaningless game. Voices raised, inmates gathering, guards moving in. The perfect catalyst for Grayson's planned intervention. Right on cue, Jenkins's voice came over the loudspeaker. All inmates on the ground, this is a lockdown. On the ground now. Most inmates complied immediately, conditioned by years of institutional response. But at the center of the gathering, Dre and Krebs continued their manufactured confrontation, drawing attention, creating the perfect focal point for whatever Grayson had planned. The response team entered the yard in full riot gear, a disproportionate show of force for what appeared to be a simple altercation. At their center walked Ray Grayson, unauthorized but unmistakable in his civilian clothes, a security badge, clipped to his belt. Riot protocol activated, he shouted, taking command despite his suspended status. Subdue the instigators. The response team moved with practiced efficiency, but something was off in their coordination. Hesitation where there should have been certainty. Glances exchanged that revealed internal conflict. Captain Morris, arriving moments later, stared in disbelief at Grayson's presence. Grayson! You're not authorized to be here! Morris shouted over the growing chaos. Containing a situation your people can't handle, Grayson retorted, gesturing toward the basketball court, where the confrontation was escalating precisely as planned. What happened next occurred with such speed that later accounts would conflict. Grayson, moving toward the center of the disturbance, pointed directly at Malik, who remained kneeling as ordered. Carter's signaling Washington, he shouted. He's coordinating this. Take him down. 2 guards moved toward Malik, batons raised. Jake Landry stepped between them, hand raised. He's complying, No threat. In the confusion, something flashed. In Grayson's hand. A small shank, the same type supposedly found in Malik's cell during the earlier search. With a fluid motion born of experience, he slipped it into the waistband of an unresisting inmate nearby. "Weapon!" Grayson shouted. "Southeast corner, multiple weapons." The response escalated instantly. Pepper spray deployed, batons swinging. Inmates who had been peacefully complying found themselves caught in a wave of institutional violence triggered by a fabricated threat. Jake Landry, witnessing Grayson's manipulation firsthand, made a split-second decision. He activated his body camera, standard equipment for all guards but typically used selectively, ensuring it captured Grayson planting evidence, directing unauthorized force. "Captain Morris!" Jake shouted above the chaos. "Grayson is planting weapons. It's on my camera." Grayson's head snapped toward Jake, comprehension and fury flooding his features. He lunged toward the young guard, intent on seizing the camera, but his movement created an opening in the response line. In that moment, the carefully orchestrated chaos transformed into genuine disorder. Inmates scrambled away from the spray, and batons, guards shouted conflicting orders. And at the center of it all, Grayson abandoned protocol entirely, physically grappling with Jake for control of the crucial evidence. "Restrain Officer Grayson." Morris's command cut through the pandemonium, authority finally reasserted. All inmates returned to compliance positions. Response team, stand down. 2 guards, neither from Grayson's inner circle, moved to separate him from Jake. Grayson, beyond rational calculation now, shoved them violently away. "You don't understand what's happening here," he shouted, desperation evident. "Carter's orchestrating all of this. He's manipulating everything." In his frenzy, Grayson didn't notice Warden Martinez entering the yard, accompanied by 2 individuals. In suits, the advance team from the Department of Justice witnessing the meltdown of Coldwater's former authority figure in real time. "Officer Grayson," Martinez's voice cut through the noise with cold precision. "You are trespassing on a secure facility while on administrative leave. You have assaulted staff members and appear to be inciting a riot. You are hereby detained, pending criminal charges." The fight drained from Grayson as reality reasserted itself. Around him, the yard had fallen silent, inmates and guards alike frozen in a tableau of institutional breakdown. His gaze found Malik, still kneeling, expression carefully neutral despite the victory unfolding. As Morris and 2 senior guards escorted Grayson from the yard, Martinez took command of the aftermath with methodical efficiency. All inmates returned to cells in an orderly fashion. Medical team to attend to any injuries. "Captain Morris, I want a full incident report within the hour." She turned to Jake Landry. "Officer Landry, secure that body camera footage immediately. It is now evidence in a criminal investigation." In the administration conference room that afternoon, Martinez sat with the DOJ representatives, reviewing the footage from Jake's body camera. The evidence was unequivocal. Ray Grayson, unauthorized on prison grounds, planting contraband, ordering excessive force, assaulting staff. "This is beyond administrative violations," the senior DOJ investigator noted. "We're looking at criminal charges, civil rights violations, assault, evidence tampering." "And this appears to be standard procedure," added his colleague, gesturing to the additional evidence on her laptop. The files Rawlings had provided, documenting years of systematic abuses. "The pattern is consistent and pervasive." Martinez nodded grimly. "I suspected the corruption ran deep, but this—" She paused as Captain Morris entered with a medical report from the yard incident. 3 inmates with minor injuries, all treated on site, Morris reported. "And one more thing you should know. The initial confrontation between Washington and Krebs? Several inmates are saying it was staged, designed to draw Grayson out." "Carter," Martinez said quietly, pieces falling into place. "He anticipated Grayson's move and set a trap." Morris nodded. "Looks that way. Washington and Krebs are both asking to make statements about Grayson's long-term manipulation of racial tensions within the prison." The DOJ investigators exchanged glances. If inmates from opposing factions are corroborating each other's accounts, that strengthens the case significantly. It also raises questions about Carter's role, Martinez mused. The level of coordination required to orchestrate this suggests he has substantial influence throughout the prison population. Or, Morris suggested carefully, it suggests that the common experience of abuse under Grayson's regime created natural allies, once someone demonstrated that resistance was possible. Martinez considered this. Either way, I want Carter's full statement immediately, and arrange for Washington and Krebs to be interviewed separately. Let's see how their accounts align. As the meeting adjourned, Martinez found herself re-evaluating Malik Carter. She had viewed him as a victim of systematic injustice, but the events in the yard revealed something more complex. A man who had used his 12 years of confinement to understand the system so thoroughly that he could turn it against itself. It was an unsettling realization. Justice and manipulation often resembled each other more closely than comfortable moral distinctions would prefer. In his cell that evening, Malik sat motionless on his bunk, the day's events replaying in his mind. The plan had worked. Grayson had exposed himself more thoroughly than even Malik had anticipated, destroying his own career in a public meltdown captured on official equipment. Yet victory felt hollow. 12 years of single-minded focus on bringing down Ray Grayson had sustained Malik through countless indignities and abuses. Now that the goal was within reach, he found himself contemplating the space that would be left when vengeance was finally complete. His meditation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Landry at his cell door. "Martinez wants to see you," Jake said quietly. "My body camera footage has been secured by the DOJ team. Grayson's being held for charging." Malik stood, offering his wrists for the procedural handcuffing. "And you? After what happened in the yard, you've made enemies." Jake's hands trembled slightly as he applied the restraints. "I knew what I was doing. Some things matter more than a comfortable career." As they walked through the now quiet cell block, Jake added, "For what it's worth, I reviewed your original case file. The inconsistencies, the coerced testimony, the inadequate defense, you never should have been here." "That was never the point," Malik replied softly. "Then what was?" Malik considered the question as they approached the administration wing, the heart of the system he had studied and manipulated for more than a decade. "Accountability," he finally answered. "A system without it isn't justice, it's just power wearing a uniform." Jake nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "And now? With Grayson facing charges, the DOJ investigation, Martinez's reforms, now comes the hard part," Malik said as they reached the warden's office. "Making sure it actually changes something." The door opened to reveal Martinez waiting with a DOJ investigator, expressions grave. On the table between them lay a thick folder, Malik's complete case file, including the new evidence Rawlings had provided about Grayson's interference with his appeals. "Mr. Carter," Martinez began, "we have some matters to discuss regarding your original conviction." As Malik took a seat, he felt the weight of 12 years, of patience, calculation, and carefully channeled rage beginning to shift. The system that had taken his freedom was finally being forced to acknowledge its failure. Grayson was only the most visible symptom of a deeper disease. The true reckoning had just begun. The holding cell in Coldwater's administrative segregation unit wasn't designed for staff. Its dimensions, 8 by 10 feet of concrete and steel, were identical to those used for inmates awaiting disciplinary hearings, but Ray Grayson's presence there marked an unprecedented reversal. For 15 years, he had been the one who decided who went into these cells. Now he sat on the thin mattress, staring at the institutional beige walls, listening to the familiar sounds of cold water from the wrong side of the bars. Legal proceedings moved slowly, but administrative action did not. Within 24 hours of the yard incident, Martinez had filed formal termination paperwork. Grayson was no longer suspended. He was fired, his pension under review, criminal, charges pending. The only reason he remained at Coldwater rather than the county jail was Martinez's decision that transferring him before completing all witness statements would complicate the investigation. The door at the end of the corridor opened, and Grayson looked up to see Officer Bill Rawlings approaching, accompanied by one of the DOJ investigators. "Interview time, Grayson," Rawlings announced, voice carefully neutral though his eyes revealed a certain satisfaction. Grayson stood slowly. "So it's just Grayson now? Not Ray or Sir like the past 10 years? Rawlings didn't respond, simply opening the cell door and applying restraints with procedural precision. The role reversal wasn't lost on either man. How many times had they stood on opposite sides of this interaction? In the interview room, Warden Martinez waited with the senior DOJ investigator, files spread across the table between them. Grayson was directed to a chair, not the comfortable one he would have taken during disciplinary hearings, but the steel one bolted to the floor, designated for inmates. "Mr. Grayson," Martinez began, emphasizing his civilian status, "we have some questions regarding your activities during the yard incident yesterday, as well as broader patterns of conduct during your tenure at Coldwater." Grayson leaned back, affecting a confidence he no longer felt. "I was responding to an emergency situation that your staff wasn't equipped to handle. Anything else is a matter for my attorney." "Your attorney will have plenty to address," the DOJ investigator replied, opening a folder. "Officer Rawlings has provided extensive documentation of systematic civil rights violations under your supervision. We're talking witness tampering, evidence falsification, excessive force authorization, a pattern spanning at least 8 years. Grayson's eyes darted to Rawlings, who stood impassively by the door. "Rawlings doesn't know what he's talking about. Any actions I took were within procedural guidelines for maintaining institutional security." "That's not what the recordings indicate," Martinez said, pressing a button on a digital recorder. Grayson's voice filled the room. "Jenkins, make sure the contraband is planted before the search. I want Carter's appeal buried for good this time. No mistakes." Then Rawlings' voice. "What if Martinez asks questions?" Grayson again. "She won't if we do this right. One more incident in his file, he's done. Nobody's going to risk their career on a lifer with disciplinary issues." Martinez stopped the recording. "Officer Rawlings has provided 7 such recordings, all documenting similar directives. Combined with Officer Landry's body camera footage from yesterday, they present a compelling case of ongoing misconduct." Grayson turned to Rawlings, fury and betrayal etched across his features. "You recorded me? For how long?" 3 years, Rawlings replied evenly. "Started when you ordered me to falsify that assault report on Rodriguez. Insurance policy. You followed every order. You benefited from the system just like everyone else. And I'm paying for that now," Rawlings acknowledged, a flash of genuine regret crossing his face. "Difference is I'm cooperating. Full disclosure in exchange for immunity from prosecution." The realization struck Grayson like a physical blow. Rawlings wasn't just providing evidence. He was saving himself by offering up his former superior. The ultimate betrayal from a man he'd considered his most reliable lieutenant. "This interview is over," Grayson stated flatly. "I want my attorney present for any further questions." Martinez nodded. "That's your right. Your attorney has been contacted and will arrive tomorrow morning. Until then, you'll remain in administrative segregation. Officer Rawlings, please escort Mr. Grayson back to his cell." As they left the room, Grayson kept his eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge Rawlings. The betrayal stung deeper than the charges themselves, the collapse of solidarity that had been the foundation of his power at Coldwater. "Why?" he finally asked as they approached the segregation unit. "After everything we built here?" Rawlings checked that they were momentarily alone in the corridor before answering. "Because you lost control, Ray. The yard incident crossed a line. Assaulting staff, planting evidence in front of witnesses. You became a liability." "So it's self-preservation," Grayson sneered. "At least be honest about that." "Partly," Rawlings conceded. "But it's also because for 15 years I told myself we were maintaining necessary order. Yesterday, watching you try to frame Carter again, seeing how far you'd go, I finally admitted we crossed from order to abuse a long time ago." Before Grayson could respond, they reached the segregation unit. The guard on duty, Officer Peterson, a younger man who had never been part of Grayson's inner circle, unlocked the secure door. Transfer paperwork came through, Peterson informed Rawlings. Grayson's being moved to county tomorrow after his attorney meeting. Martinez signed off an hour ago. "I'll be back for morning escort," Rawlings replied, securing Grayson in his cell. As he turned to leave, he paused. "For what it's worth, Ray, none of this was personal." "It was always personal," Grayson retorted. "That was the whole goddamn point." Alone again in his cell, Grayson felt the walls of his carefully constructed world continuing to collapse. Tomorrow he would leave Coldwater, not as the feared enforcer who had shaped its culture for over a decade, but as a disgraceful footnote in its institutional history. In Warden Martinez's office, Malik Carter sat with uncharacteristic tension. After 12 years of maintaining careful control over every expression, every word, he found himself in uncharted territory, being treated not as an inmate but as a key witness in a federal investigation that could potentially lead to his exoneration. "Your original case is being reviewed by the State Attorney General's office," Martinez explained, sliding a document across her desk. "Based on the evidence Rawlings provided about Grayson's interference with your appeals, plus the documentation of procedural violations during your original arrest and conviction, there are grounds for a full re-examination." Malik scanned the paper, official notification that his case was under review for potential vacating of charges. After 12 years of fighting a system designed to ignore him, seeing official acknowledgement was surreal. "And Grayson?" he asked, the question that had driven him for over a decade finally given voice. "Terminated as of this morning, being held in administrative segregation until his attorney arrives tomorrow, then transferred to county jail, pending arraignment on multiple charges: evidence tampering, assault, civil rights violations, and potentially conspiracy charges based on Rawlings's testimony." Malik absorbed this information with outward calm, though beneath the surface emotions surged. Vindication, yes, but also a strange hollowness. The moment he had methodically worked toward for 12 years had arrived, yet something felt unfinished. "What happens to him after that?" Martinez studied him carefully. "That depends on the courts now. With the evidence we have, he's likely facing significant prison time." "But not here," Malik observed. "He'll go to a different facility, possibly minimum security given his former position." "Standard procedure for former law enforcement," Martinez confirmed. "The system protects its own, even in disgrace." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. How the same system that had shown Malik no mercy would make accommodations for Grayson, despite his more grievous betrayal of public trust. "There's a memorial service tomorrow," Malik said, changing direction. "For Thomas Jefferson." Martinez nodded, recognizing the name. "The inmate who died during the cafeteria incident 3 years ago." I reviewed the file, officially ruled an accident during restraint procedures. "It wasn't an accident," Malik stated flatly. "Grayson crushed his windpipe deliberately, then falsified the report. Jefferson had been gathering evidence of guard misconduct, similar to what I've been doing but less carefully. Grayson made an example of him. Do you have proof of this?" "Ask Rawlings. He was there." Malik leaned forward slightly. "The point is the memorial is happening in the chapel tomorrow morning. Most of D Block will be there, including men who witnessed what Grayson did." Martinez's expression sharpened with sudden understanding. "You're telling me this because you should be aware of the potential security implications," Malik finished smoothly. "Emotions run high at these memorials, especially when reminiscing about how Jefferson died. It wasn't a threat, not explicitly, but the subtext was clear. Grayson would be in the facility during a gathering of men with every reason to want retribution, separated only by Coldwater's always tenuous security measures." Martinez studied him for a long moment. "Is there something specific you're suggesting, Mr. Carter?" "Just providing context," Malik replied. "As a concerned party in the ongoing investigation." Before Martinez could respond, Captain Morris entered with an urgent update. Warden, we have a situation with the DOJ evidence. The digital recordings from Rawlings, they've been corrupted. On the secure server, IT says it looks like a targeted deletion. Martinez stood immediately. How is that possible? Who has access? That's the problem. The access logs show administrator credentials being used at 2 a.m. Only 3 people have that level of access, you, me, and the IT director. None of whom would sabotage a federal investigation, Martinez concluded grimly. Which means someone else obtained administrator access. Do we have backups? Working on it, Morris replied. But there's more. The body camera footage from Officer Landry is also missing from evidence storage. The implications were immediate and disturbing. Someone inside Coldwater was actively working to destroy evidence against Grayson. With the digital records compromised, the case would rely heavily on witness testimony, which was always more vulnerable to challenge. I need to meet with the DOJ team immediately, Martinez decided. Mr. Carter, we'll continue our discussion later. Captain Morris, please escort him back to his cell. As Malik stood to leave, he noted the new urgency in Martinez's movements, the calculation behind her eyes. The evidence tampering had created exactly the kind of institutional crisis that divided attention and resources, precisely what his broader strategy required. The morning broke cold and gray over Coldwater, a fine mist clinging to the razor wire that crowned the perimeter walls. In the chapel, a repurposed storage room with wooden benches and a simple pulpit, inmates from D Block gathered for Thomas Jefferson's memorial service. The official ceremony was brief, led by the visiting chaplain, but everyone understood the real commemoration would happen afterward, when the chaplain departed and the inmates spoke their own truths. Big Dre stood at the front, his imposing presence commanding attention as he began the unofficial portion of the service. 3 years ago today, our brother Thomas Jefferson was murdered in this place, he stated bluntly, no longer constrained by the euphemisms required during the chaplain's presence. Murdered for standing up, for documenting what was happening to us. Murdered by a man who thought he was above accountability. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered inmates. That man is still in this facility today, Dre continued, his voice carrying to the back of the room where the guard on duty, Officer Hanson, relatively new and uninvolved in Grayson's system, shifted uncomfortably. Still breathing the same air as us, still protected by the same system that let him crush Jefferson's throat and call it an accident. The tension in the room thickened. Krebs, seated with several Brotherhood members in an unprecedented show of racial solidarity, nodded, grimly. 12 years some of us have waited for any kind of justice. Dre's gaze moved across the faces before him. Jefferson waited too, but he never saw it. At the back of the chapel, the door opened. Officer Jake Landry entered, expression tense. He beckoned urgently to Hanson, who moved to speak with him. Their whispered conversation lasted only moments, before Hanson departed rapidly, leaving Landry alone on guard duty. This deviation from protocol didn't go unnoticed. Malik, seated near the middle of the assembly, recognized it for what it was, the first piece of a carefully coordinated sequence falling into place. Brother Jefferson believed in accountability, Dre continued, building toward something that every man in the room could feel coming. He believed that no one, not even those with keys and batons, should be above judgment. In the administration wing, the crisis was accelerating. Martinez had convened an emergency meeting with the DOJ investigators when the facility's secure communication system suddenly failed. Phone lines, radio channels, internal email, all went dark simultaneously. Systematic failure, the IT director reported frantically. Someone planted a shutdown protocol in the system. Backup generators are running lights and physical security, but communications are completely down. How long to restore? Martinez demanded. 2 hours minimum, we need to reboot the entire network. Martinez turned to Captain Morris. Manual protocols. Guards at all secure points, runner communication between stations, double visual verification of all movement. Already implementing, Morris confirmed. But we're thin today. 8 officers called in sick this morning. Unusual pattern. Not a coincidence, Martinez realized, the pieces connecting rapidly. Someone coordinated this. Where is Grayson now? Segregation unit awaiting his attorney, scheduled to arrive at 9:30. Martinez checked her watch. 9:22. Get there now. I want him moved to a more secure location immediately. As Morris hurried to comply, Martinez felt the disturbing sensation of being outmaneuvered on her own ground. The communications failure, the missing guards, the compromised evidence, all pointed to a coordinated effort beyond what she'd believed possible within Coldwater's walls. In the segregation unit, Ray Grayson paced his cell impatiently. His attorney was due any minute, the first step in what would be a protracted legal battle. He had no illusions about avoiding all consequences, but with the right legal strategy and his knowledge of the system, he could minimize the damage. Perhaps even negotiate a deal that kept him out of prison altogether. The secure door at the end of the corridor opened and Grayson straightened expectantly. Instead of his attorney or a guard escort, however, a maintenance worker entered, pushing a cleaning cart. "Where's Officer Peterson?" Grayson demanded. "My attorney's due now." The maintenance worker, an older Hispanic man Grayson vaguely recognized but couldn't name, began mopping without response. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Grayson's voice rose with frustration. The worker finally looked up, expression unreadable. "Peterson got called away. Emergency in A block." "Then who's monitoring this unit?" The man shrugged. "Not my job to know." He continued mopping, working his way methodically toward the control panel that operated the cell doors. Grayson felt the first stirrings of genuine alarm. Segregation was never left unmonitored. Emergency protocols required at least one officer present at all times. "I need to speak to Captain Morris," he said, striving for authority despite his circumstances. "Or Warden Martinez, right now." "Communications are down," the worker replied casually. "Whole system crashed about 10 minutes ago." As this information registered, the maintenance worker reached the control panel. With movements too practiced to be unfamiliar, he swiped a security card, one that shouldn't have worked for his access level, and entered a code on the keypad. A metallic click echoed through the unit as all cell doors unlocked simultaneously. "What are you doing?" Grayson demanded, panic finally breaking through his composure. "That's a security violation." The worker, Miguel Suarez, trustee and Coldwater's most overlooked set of eyes and ears, looked directly at Grayson for the first time. "Fixing a broken system," he replied simply, then turned and walked out, leaving the unit door open behind him. For several seconds, Grayson remained frozen in his cell, the open door both escape and trap. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor, multiple sets, approaching with deliberate pace. Big Dre appeared first, his massive frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Krebs, eyes cold with purpose. Then others, a procession of men Grayson recognized from countless disciplinary actions. Men whose appeals he had blocked, whose parole he had denied, whose dignity he had systematically stripped, away for more than a decade. "This is a mistake," Grayson said, backing against the far wall of his cell. "Whatever you're planning—" "We're not planning anything, Officer Grayson," Dre interrupted, emphasizing the title with bitter irony. "Just came to talk. About Thomas Jefferson, about justice, about accountability. The guards will be here any minute," Grayson threatened, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his doubt. "Actually," Krebs said, stepping forward, "they won't. Shift change confusion, communication systems down, mysterious emergency in A block. It's almost like someone designed this situation specifically." "Carter," Grayson breathed, the final piece clicking into place. "This is his doing." "Carter isn't even here," Dre replied. "Doesn't need to be. He just needed to show us that the system can work both ways." As the men moved into his cell, surrounding him completely, Grayson finally understood the true extent of Malik Carter's revenge. Not direct violence, nothing so simple or traceable, but a perfect reversal of power, meticulously engineered. Grayson, who had used Coldwater's systems to isolate and control others, now found himself isolated and controlled by those same systems. "We have about 15 minutes, Dre informed the gathered men, his voice carrying the weight of judgment. Just enough time for Officer Grayson to understand exactly what Thomas Jefferson felt. What we've all felt. The experience of being completely at the mercy of someone else's power. As hands reached for him from all sides, Ray Grayson, who had spent 15 years as the unchallenged authority of Coldwater Penitentiary, finally confronted the true meaning of powerlessness. Blood trickled from Ray Grayson's split lip as he huddled against the wall of his cell. The initial fury of the inmates had been controlled, calculated in its application of pain. These men, who had learned brutality from the master himself, were methodical in their retribution. No fatal wounds, no permanent damage, just enough force to strip away the last vestiges of his dignity and control. "Enough," Big Dre ordered, as Krebs landed another blow to Grayson's ribs. "He needs to be able to talk." Krebs stepped back reluctantly, knuckles raw. The small cell was crowded with 8 inmates, representatives from various factions, each with their own history of abuse under Grayson's rule. Outside in the corridor, lookouts maintained watch for any approaching staff. Grayson's breathing came in shallow gasps, one eye swollen shut, his once immaculate appearance reduced to bloody tatters. But even in this state, defiance flickered behind his remaining good eye. "You're all dead men," he managed between painful breaths. "When they find out what you've done, what we've done," Krebs laughed bitterly. "We're just following your example, Officer Grayson. Isn't this how you taught us justice works? The strong decide what happens to the weak?" Before Grayson could respond, the corridor lookout signaled. Someone was approaching. The inmates tensed, preparing for confrontation, but as the figure appeared in the doorway, collective surprise rippled through the group. Malik Carter stood before them, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. He wore no restraints, moved with no guard escort, a detail that wasn't lost on Grayson despite his pain-clouded mind. "This wasn't the plan," Dre said quietly. "You were supposed to stay clear." "Plans change," Malik replied, stepping into the already crowded cell. His gaze settled on Grayson's battered form. "All of you out. I need 10 minutes alone with him." A murmur of protest rose from the gathered men. Krebs stepped forward. "We're not finished. He needs to pay for Jefferson. For all of them." "And he will," Malik assured him. "But not like this. Not just more violence that feeds the same system. 10 minutes. Then you can decide." Something in Malik's tone, the quiet authority earned through years of strategic patience, silenced further objections. One by one, the inmates filed out, leaving only Dre lingering at the doorway. 10 minutes, he confirmed, his expression conveying the weight of trust being extended. "But if he walks out of here without answering for what he's done," "He won't," Malik promised. "One way or another, this ends today." When they were alone, Malik studied Grayson in silence. 12 years of hatred, of meticulously planned vengeance, distilled into this singular moment. The architect of his suffering, now broken and bloody at his feet. It should have felt triumphant. Instead, Malik felt a hollow uncertainty. "Come to gloat?" Grayson spat blood onto the floor. "Didn't think you had the stomach for this." "I orchestrated all of it," Malik replied calmly. "The evidence sabotage, the communications failure, the guard reassignments, every detail designed to create this exact situation." He crouched to eye level with Grayson. "But unlike you, I don't take pleasure in suffering." "Bullshit. This was always your endgame." "My endgame is justice. There's a difference." Malik reached into his pocket and withdrew a small recording device, the kind used by the prison's legal team for official statements. "Which is why I'm offering you a choice." Grayson eyed the device warily. Option 1, you give a complete confession. Every case you tampered with, every appeal you blocked, every inmate you abused or had others abuse. Names, dates, details, all of it, on record. "And why would I do that?" "Because of option 2. Malik nodded toward the door where the other inmates waited. I walk out. Tell them you refuse to acknowledge what you've done, and let them finish what they started. No confession, no intervention, no mercy. Understanding dawned in Grayson's battered face. You're blackmailing me. Confess or die. I'm offering accountability, something you denied me and countless others for years. Malik activated the recorder and set it on the floor between them. Your choice, but you have 8 minutes to decide. In the administrative wing, chaos had given way to methodical crisis management. Martinez had established a command center in the conference room, coordinating search teams through runner communication while technical staff worked to restore the compromised systems. Still no sign of Grayson, Captain Morris reported, returning from his third sweep of the segregation unit. The maintenance logs show Miguel Suarez was assigned there, but he's missing too. And the security footage for that entire corridor is down. Martinez processed this with growing concern. What about Carter? Where is he now? Last seen in the chapel during the memorial service. Officer Landry was supervising, but then got called to assist with the communications failure in A block. And who issued that order? Morris hesitated. It came through the radio system just before everything went down. Supposedly from me, but it wasn't, Martinez finished grimly. Someone is coordinating this entire situation. The question is whether it's to help Grayson escape or to trap him. The door opened and Jake Landry entered, his uniform disheveled, expression tense. Warden, I need to speak with you. Privately. Something in his tone caused Martinez to dismiss the others with a gesture. When they were alone, Jake's composure cracked. I think I helped set this up, he confessed, voice barely above a whisper. Without realizing it, the chapel duty, the call to A block, it was all too coordinated. Explain, Martinez demanded. After the yard incident, Carter told me to make sure certain security cameras were offline for maintenance today, said. It was to protect witnesses who would be coming forward against Grayson. Jake's words tumbled out with the relief of confession. I didn't know it would create this situation, I swear. I thought we were just ensuring testimonies couldn't be monitored or intercepted. Martinez studied him with new wariness. So Carter orchestrated this communications failure? Not directly, but he understood the systems well enough to know how they could be manipulated, where the vulnerabilities were. Jake looked up. Realization dawning. He's been planning this for years. Every detail, every contingency. Not just exposing Grayson, but creating a situation where... He couldn't finish the thought, but Martinez understood. A situation where Grayson would be completely vulnerable to the very men he had terrorized for years. We need to find them, now. Martinez moved toward the door, then paused. Officer Landry, I need to know. Are you still following Carter's instructions? Is there more to this plan I should be aware of? Jake's hesitation was answer enough. Whatever you've done, whatever role you've played, if anything happens to Grayson, you're complicit in it. Think very carefully about your next steps. In Suad, the segregation cell, time was running out. Grayson had listened in silence as Malik outlined the scope of his confession, not just the offenses against him personally, but the entire system of corruption Grayson had built at Coldwater over 15 years. Even if I wanted to, Grayson rasped. There's no guarantee they'll let me live after I confess. There's my guarantee, Malik replied, which is more than you ever gave any of us. Why should I trust you? I made your life hell for 12 years. Because unlike you, I understand the difference between justice and revenge. Malik leaned closer. The men out there want blood. I want truth. Give me the truth and you get to walk out of here alive. It's more mercy than you deserve. Seconds ticked by as Grayson weighed his options. Through the haze of pain and fear, one reality emerged with crystal clarity. Malik Carter had outmaneuvered him completely. Every avenue of escape, every potential ally, every system of protection, all had been systematically neutralized by the very man he had spent years trying to break. 3 minutes, Grayson, Malik prompted. Choose. Something broke in Grayson then, not just physically, but a deeper fracturing of the certainty that had defined his life. For 15 years, he had operated with absolute conviction in his own authority, in the rightness of his methods, in his immunity from consequences. Now, bleeding on the floor of a cell he had consigned countless others to, that conviction crumbled to dust. "Turn on the recorder," he said quietly. For the next 7 minutes, Ray Grayson spoke without interruption. He detailed the systematic abuse of power, the fabricated incident reports, the denied appeals, the orchestrated attacks. He named co-conspirators, including guards still employed at Coldwater. He confirmed what Malik had claimed for years. That evidence had been planted to prevent his release, that his case had been deliberately suppressed through intimidation and falsified documentation. Most damning of all, he confessed to direct involvement in Thomas Jefferson's death. Not an accident during restraint, but a deliberate killing to silence a potential whistleblower. As Grayson spoke, Malik watched him with an expression that shifted from vindication to something more complex. There was no satisfaction in seeing this broken man enumerate his crimes, only a weighted recognition of how systems corrupt those they empower, and how that corruption spreads outward in concentric circles of harm. When the confession was complete, Malik pocketed the recorder. "You'll be taken to the infirmary now. When you recover, you'll repeat this confession to the DOJ investigators. And if I don't?" Some shadow of Grayson's former defiance flickered briefly. "The recording goes to every inmate in Coldwater, along with the knowledge that you're being held in the minimum security medical wing." Malik stood. "Your choice, as always." He moved to the door and signaled to Dre, who entered with Krebs and 2 others. "He's confessed," Malik told them. "Everything. Jefferson, the planted evidence, all of it. It's recorded and secured." "That doesn't balance the scales," Krebs argued, eyeing Grayson with undisguised hatred. "Words don't pay for blood." "No," Malik agreed. "But his confession ensures that the system can't protect him anymore. He'll face charges, serve time, real time, not some administrative detention, and everyone will know what he did." "And you think that's enough?" Dre asked quietly. After everything, Malik considered the question with genuine introspection. Was it enough? Could any punishment truly balance 12 years of systematic abuse? The lost appeals, the extended sentences, the daily indignities and physical suffering? "It has to be," he finally answered. "Because the alternative makes us no better than him, and I've spent 12 years fighting to prove that we are better, that the system is wrong about who we are, what we deserve." A long moment of tension stretched between them. Then slowly Dre nodded. "Take him to the infirmary," he instructed the others. "Alive. Martinez will be searching by now. We need to be back in our assigned areas when they restore communications." As they lifted Grayson, Malik added one final condition. "Make sure he's found with the recorder. I want no question about where that confession came from or how it was obtained." Warden Martinez was halfway to the segregation unit with a response. "Team," when the communication system suddenly reactivated. Radios crackled to life, phones began ringing, and the first security camera feeds reappeared on monitoring stations. "Systems back online," the security chief reported. "Looks like the shutdown protocol terminated itself automatically." "Segregation unit cameras?" Martinez demanded. "Coming up now." The monitor flickered, then displayed the segregation corridor. Empty, cell doors closed. No sign of Grayson or any inmates. "Sweep every inch," Martinez ordered the response team. "Find Grayson, and find Carter." As the team deployed, Jake Landry approached tentatively. "Warden, there's something else you should know. About the memorial service today." Martinez turned to him with thinly veiled impatience. "Officer Landry, if you're still withholding information—" "The infirmary," Jake interrupted. "Check the infirmary." 20 minutes later, Martinez stood in the doorway of the prison medical wing, observing a scene that defied easy explanation. Ray Grayson lay on a treatment bed, conscious but injured, a small recording device on the table beside him. Dr. Roberts was treating his wounds while 2 guards, neither from Grayson's inner circle, maintained watch. He was found in the corridor. Outside, Dr. Roberts reported. Brought himself here somehow. Multiple contusions, 2 cracked ribs, but nothing life-threatening. And the recorder? Martinez asked. Was in his hand when they found him. Insisted it not be touched until you arrived. Martinez approached Grayson, who tracked her movement with his one good eye. What happened? Listen to the recording, he replied, voice hollow with defeat. It's all there. Martinez picked up the device, considering it carefully before addressing the guards. No one enters or leaves until further notice, and find out where every inmate was during the communications. Failure, especially Carter. As she turned to leave, Grayson spoke again. He was right, you know. Martinez paused. About what? The system. It's not about justice. Never was. Grayson's gaze drifted to the ceiling. Took me 15 years to build it. He dismantled it in 3 weeks. And sent you to the hospital in the process, Martinez observed. No, Grayson replied, a bitter smile twisting his swollen lips. He could have sent me to the morgue. That's the difference between us. Always was. Malik sat, alone in his cell as the lockdown protocol was finally lifted. Through his window he could see guards escorting inmates back to their assigned areas, the methodical restoration of Coldwater's routine already underway. Systems reasserting themselves, order reclaiming chaos. He felt strangely disconnected from it all. For 12 years, every moment had been focused on a single purpose: exposing Grayson, proving his own innocence, obtaining some measure of justice from a system designed to deny it. Now, with Grayson's confession secured and his own case under review, the absence of that driving purpose left an unexpected void. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Warden Martinez at his cell door, her expression inscrutable, as she studied him. Interesting day at Coldwater, she observed. Communications failure, security breaches, and Officer Grayson found beaten but alive in the medical wing, with a fully detailed confession of his crimes, conveniently recorded. Malik met her gaze steadily. Sounds like the system working for once. Does it? Martinez signaled for the guard to open the cell. Because from where I stand, it looks like the system was hijacked, manipulated, used to exact personal retribution. Justice and retribution share a border, Malik replied, rising to his feet. Sometimes you have to cross it to arrive at the truth. That's a dangerous philosophy, Mr. Carter, one that justifies any means for desired ends. So is believing that official channels always lead to justice. Martinez considered this, then produced the recorder from her pocket. I've listened to Grayson's confession. It's extensive, damning, precisely what we needed to ensure he faces full accountability. Then why do you sound disappointed? Because I'm not convinced this victory advances justice as much as it satisfies vengeance. Martinez stepped closer. Did you orchestrate what happened today? The communications failure, the security breaches, Grayson's beating? Malik's expression remained unreadable. You have a confession that will help correct 12 years of injustice, not just for me, but for dozens of others Grayson victimized. Does how you obtained it outweigh what it accomplishes? That's the central question of any justice system, isn't it? Martinez replied. When does the pursuit of a righteous outcome justify corrupting the process itself? Their gazes held, mutual recognition passing between them, two people who believed in justice but diverged on how to achieve it. The tension was broken by Captain Morris appearing at the door. Warden, the DOJ team is ready to resume interviews. They're particularly interested in speaking with Mr. Carter now that we have Grayson's confession. Martinez nodded, stepping back. Mr. Carter will be along shortly. I believe we're finished here. As she turned to leave, Malik spoke one last time. Warden, when the system consistently fails those it claims to serve, who bears the moral burden? Those who break its rules seeking justice, or those who uphold rules that perpetuate injustice? Martinez paused, considering the question with genuine reflection. Perhaps, she finally answered. That's what we're all here to determine. 3 weeks after Ray Grayson's confession, The halls of Coldwater Penitentiary echoed with the sound of systemic change. Department of Justice officials occupied the administrative offices, interviewing guards and inmates, reviewing files, and dismantling the infrastructure of corruption that had defined the institution for over a decade. In Warden Martinez's office, Malik Carter sat across from a representative of the state attorney general, the culmination of 12 years of struggle contained in the single document between them. "The court has vacated your conviction," the official explained, her tone clinically professional, though her eyes conveyed genuine regret. "Based on the evidence of procedural misconduct, witness tampering, and Officer Grayson's sworn statement, we've determined that your original trial was fundamentally compromised." Malik studied the document, a court order for his immediate release accompanied by the formal beginnings of a wrongful imprisonment claim. The words swam before him, legal language that somehow failed to encompass the reality of 12 stolen years. "What about the others?" he asked. "Jefferson's family, the men Grayson targeted after me?" "Each case is being reviewed individually," she replied. "But your documentation was exceptional. Most inmates don't maintain such comprehensive records of institutional abuses." "Most inmates aren't given the chance," Malik observed quietly. The attorney nodded, acknowledging the truth in this. "Your release is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Standard procedure would have you process out through the main entrance, but given the circumstances, Warden Martinez has arranged a more private exit through the administrative wing." "That won't be necessary," Malik said. "I'll leave the same way everyone else does." After the attorney departed, Warden Martinez entered, carrying a folder of her own. "I just received confirmation that Grayson has been formally charged. 27 counts ranging from civil rights violations to second-degree murder for Jefferson. Even with plea negotiations, he's looking at a minimum of 30 years. At a minimum security facility with protective custody," Malik noted without bitterness, simply acknowledging the remaining inequities in the system. "Yes," Martinez conceded. "But that's one battle I couldn't win. The system still protects its own, even in disgrace. Some changes take longer than others." Martinez set her folder on the desk, studying Malik with renewed curiosity. Throughout the investigation, he had maintained a composed detachment, cooperating fully, providing testimony, but never displaying the vindication she had expected from a man so thoroughly exonerated. "You don't seem particularly satisfied," she observed. "After 12 years fighting for this moment." Malik considered this. "Satisfaction implies the story is finished. This is just one chapter closing. And the next chapter? Depends on what happens here after I'm gone." He gestured toward the window overlooking the prison yard. "Grayson's removed, but the conditions that allowed him to thrive remain. The segregation, the arbitrary authority, the lack of meaningful oversight." Martinez nodded slowly. "We're implementing comprehensive reforms. New staff training, independent review protocols, rehabilitation programs, all of which last exactly as long as you do." Malik interrupted gently. "Then what? Another warden, another approach, another cycle of the same fundamental problems." The observation wasn't accusatory, but Martinez felt its weight nonetheless. Her reforms, however well-intentioned, were still operating within a system designed for control rather than correction, punishment rather than rehabilitation. "What would you suggest instead?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. "Start by acknowledging that Coldwater's purpose isn't to prepare men for re-entry into society. It's to warehouse them, to remove them from public view." Malik's tone remained measured, but urgency underscored his words. "Until that fundamental purpose changes, reforms will always be temporary." Before Martinez could respond, there was a knock at the door. Officer Jake Landry entered, his expression solemn as he placed an envelope on Martinez's desk. "My resignation effective immediately," he stated quietly. "After everything that's happened, I can't continue here." Martinez opened the envelope, scanning its contents. "You've been cleared of wrongdoing in the communications failure incident. The investigation confirmed your actions were manipulated by others. That's not why I'm leaving. Jake's gaze shifted briefly to Malik. I came to Coldwater believing I could make a difference from within the system. Now I understand that's not possible, not as things stand. So you're giving up? Martinez challenged. No, I'm choosing a different path. Jake straightened, new resolve evident in his posture. I've been accepted to law school, criminal justice reform, focusing on wrongful convictions and prison conditions. Malik studied the young guard with newfound respect. A difficult road. Worth traveling, Jake replied simply. Some lessons should be expensive. After Jake departed, a contemplative silence settled between Malik and Martinez, representatives of opposing sides of a flawed system, momentarily united in recognition of its fundamental inadequacies. He'll do well, Malik observed finally. He understands the cost now. As do we all, Martinez replied, rising from her desk. I'll see you tomorrow for your release processing, Mr. Carter. 9 a.m. The evening before his release, Malik stood at the window of his cell, watching darkness settle over Coldwater for the last time. 12 years of the same view, concrete, walls, razor wire, floodlights that never fully extinguish the stars. Tomorrow he would see the sky without these steel and stone frames. Big Dre appeared at his cell door unusually subdued. Last night in paradise. Malik turned, offering a faint smile. Feels surreal. You earned it. Dre leaned against the doorframe. Word came down today. My case is being reviewed. Martinez fast-tracked it personally. Good. You should have been up for parole 5 years ago. Maybe. Dre shrugged massive shoulders. Difference is, now there might actually be a fair hearing. He studied Malik thoughtfully. You never told me what you'll do on the outside. It was a question Malik had contemplated extensively. After 12 years defined by a single purpose, exposing Grayson, proving his innocence, what would shape his life now? There's a legal advocacy group in Atlanta, he said finally. Works with inmates who don't have the resources to fight wrongful convictions. They've offered me a position as a case reviewer, using what you learned here to help others. Dre nodded approval. Fitting. It's a start. Malik glanced back at the window, at the prison that had contained but never truly confined his determination. This place, what happened here, it can't just end with my release or Grayson's conviction. It has to mean something more. It will, Dre assured him. You showed everyone what's possible. That matters. A guard appeared at the end of the tier, signaling the end of pre-lockdown movement. Dre straightened, extending his hand. Malik clasped it firmly, the simple gesture conveying more than words could express about their unlikely alliance and mutual respect. See you on the other side, Dre said, however long it takes. I'll be waiting, Malik promised. With a better lawyer than they gave me. After Dre departed, Malik methodically packed his few possessions, books, legal papers, letters from his sister, 12 years distilled into a small cardboard box. The material poverty of his incarceration stood in stark contrast to the wealth of knowledge and strategy he had accumulated, an education and institutional power that no university could provide. As lights out approached, Malik found himself unexpectedly reluctant to sleep. Tomorrow would bring freedom but also uncertainty. His identity had been shaped by these walls, by the daily battle against Grayson's system. Outside, he would need to become someone new while carrying the weight of who he had been. Ray Grayson sat in the county detention center's segregated housing unit, isolation necessary for his protection from the general population. The former guard's fall had been swift and complete. From Coldwater's most feared authority to a disgraced defendant awaiting trial, abandoned by colleagues and denied bail due to the severity of the charges. The cell door opened to admit his public defender, an overworked attorney handling too many cases to offer more than perfunctory representation. The prosecution has offered a deal, she informed him without preamble. Plead guilty to 12 counts, including Jefferson's death classified as manslaughter rather than murder. 30 years with possibility of parole after 22. 22 years, Grayson repeated hollowly. Nearly the same length of time he had worked in corrections, now to be spent on the opposite side of the bars. It's better than you'd get at trial, the attorney continued. The evidence is overwhelming. Multiple witnesses, your recorded confession, Officer Rawlings' testimony. I know, Grayson interrupted. I'll take the deal. The attorney seemed surprised by his quick acquiescence. Most clients, especially former law enforcement, fought desperately against the reality of lengthy sentences. There's one more thing, she added, checking her notes. Carter's attorney has requested a meeting before your transfer to state custody. Says there are matters to discuss regarding additional cases that weren't covered in your confession. Grayson's expression hardened at the mention of Malik's name. Tell him no, we have nothing to discuss. It might help your situation if you cooperate further, she suggested, though without much conviction, a procedural recommendation rather than genuine advice. Nothing will help my situation, Grayson replied with bitter clarity. Carter made sure of that. As the attorney gathered her papers to leave, Grayson was struck by the final irony of his downfall. For 15 years he had wielded absolute authority over men like Malik Carter, controlling every aspect of their existence. Now, even from outside Coldwater's walls, Carter still maintained influence over his fate, determining which additional charges might be pursued, which other victims might come forward. The power had shifted completely, and Grayson found himself in the position he had forced countless others into, utterly at the mercy of a system he could no longer manipulate. Release day dawned with unexpected solemnity. Malik stood in the processing area, civilian clothes feeling strange against his skin after years of prison uniforms. The bureaucratic procedure moved with typical institutional inefficiency. Forms to sign, property to reclaim, final checks of his identity and status. Martinez appeared as the process neared completion, observing the transition from a respectful distance. Your sister is waiting outside, she informed him. Transportation has been arranged to Atlanta as requested. Malik nodded appreciation. Thank you. I've been reviewing your original case file, Martinez continued. The arresting officer, the prosecutor who pushed for maximum sentencing despite the lack of evidence, they're both still active in the system. I know, Malik replied. Their names are at the top of my list. Martinez's eyebrow raised slightly. List? Of cases to examine in my new position. Men still enforcing laws they manipulated before. His voice held no vengeful edge, only steady determination. Grayson was a symptom, not the disease. Before Martinez could respond, the final release paperwork arrived. Malik signed his name with careful precision, the last official act of his incarceration, the first of his restored freedom. There's still a place for you here, Martinez said unexpectedly. Not as an inmate, but as a consultant. The reforms we're implementing, they would benefit from your perspective. The offer surprised him. You want me to come back to Coldwater? Voluntarily? Sometimes changing a system requires both internal and external pressure, Martinez observed. You've proven exceptionally effective at applying the latter. Perhaps you might consider helping with the former. Malik considered the proposal, recognizing its significance. Not merely an acknowledgement of his insights, but a radical inversion of the power dynamic that had defined Coldwater for decades, giving voice to those the institution had systematically silenced. I'll think about it, he promised, after I've had some time. The final security door opened, revealing the visitors area where his sister waited. Malik paused at the threshold, turning back to Martinez. Grayson once told me that some men can't be rehabilitated, he said quietly, that some only understand force. I spent 12 years proving him wrong, showing that justice doesn't require cruelty to be effective. And now? Martinez asked. Now we see if the system can learn the same lesson. With those words, Malik Carter walked through the door, leaving Coldwater Penitentiary behind physically while carrying its hard-won lessons forward. 3 months later, a small article appeared in the regional newspaper. Former correctional Officer sentenced in abuse case Ray Grayson, former senior officer at Coldwater Penitentiary, was sentenced yesterday to 30 years in state prison after pleading guilty to charges including manslaughter, civil rights violations, and abuse of office. The case, which exposed widespread corruption within the facility, has prompted a Department of Justice investigation into prison conditions statewide. Among the witnesses at the sentencing was Malik Carter, recently exonerated after serving 12 years for a crime he did not commit. Carter, now working with the Southern Justice Initiative, has become an advocate for prison reform and wrongful conviction reviews. "Today isn't about one man's punishment," Carter told reporters outside the courthouse. "It's about acknowledging that justice requires vigilance, transparency, and the courage to confront our failures as a system." Warden Ellen Martinez of Coldwater Penitentiary issued a statement announcing comprehensive reforms, including the creation of an independent oversight committee that will include formerly incarcerated individuals for the first time in the facility's history. The article, modest in size and placement, represented something remarkable: the beginning of a shift in how justice was perceived, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living process requiring constant examination and adjustment. In his small Atlanta apartment, Malik pinned the clipping to his wall alongside a map marked with dozens of pins, each representing a case under review, a life potentially reclaimed from systematic injustice. The scars of Coldwater remained, in his memories, in his occasional nightmares, in the years lost to a corrupt system. But alongside those scars grew something new: the understanding that true justice wasn't simply about punishment or retribution, but about transformation, of institutions, of individuals, and ultimately of the delicate balance between accountability and mercy that defined civilization itself. Malik turned from the wall to his desk, where another case file awaited his attention. The work continued, one life at a time, one truth at a time, one small victory against a flawed system that could, with sufficient pressure from within and without, slowly bend toward justice. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.